Chapter 269. As a sword arts master who was like a pillar in the regional academy, Hop's sword arts team had always been receiving more resources from the regional academy. After all, researching sword arts was not something that could be done just by saying it. Currently, there were four main types of methods for researching martial techniques. The first was the practical method, which was the method of synthesizing sets of skills. It was publicly acknowledged to be the method that burned the most money and time. The second type was the amalgamation method. Through deciphering and dismantling the characteristics of various skills, one could then combine them to create a new set of skills. The third type was the reasoning method. Based on the analysis of sets of skills, the analysis of their various characteristics and basic values, one could then deduce the results of the synthesis of different skills. The fourth and final type was the original method. For example, in ancient times, one would make use of the principles of wind, rain, thunder, and lightning, as well as the hatred of one's country and family, as well as myths and legends. Although there were four types of methods, when it was actually produced, it would usually be a mixture of the four methods. There was no clear differentiation. For example, the reasoning method would need to be verified through practical methods, while the amalgamation method could also produce an original result. After all, it was impossible for a set of skills to be created from a blank piece of paper. It could be inspired by various theories and phenomena in the world, or it could be inspired by other skills. However, in general, regardless of whether it was collecting sword techniques, searching for and nurturing practical methods, students who could prove their deductions, researching and analyzing the characteristics and effects of various skills in detail, or the experimental materials needed to study various natural phenomena, all of these required a lot of money. The reasoning method was not something that could be deduced just by thinking about it. The results of any step of deduction would need to be obtained through countless experiments. Each experiment would require a large number of people to try out different sword techniques, modify each movement, and change each vital energy and blood circulation. Naturally, it would require a large amount of investment. The faster one wanted to achieve it, the more money they would need to invest. Of course, other than money, one's individual abilities and realm also had a great advantage. For example, as a level 29 expert, Hop's success rate in synthesizing skills was 100%. This saved him a lot of money and time. That night, Hops was in a 5-story building in the southeast corner of the academy, researching sword arts. This building was called the Sword Tower, and it was where Hop's sword arts team was located. Hops himself was a level 29 expert, so there was no need for him to stay in the center of the sacred land to cultivate. Moreover, he did not wish for his sword arts research to be affected by the high density of ether particles in the sacred land. Hops let out a breath and looked at the papers that were spread all over the table. Looking at the many inferences and densely packed information, he could not help but rub his eyes and sigh. I've already understood the characteristics of the flying dragon sword technique and the darkness slaying sword, but the effects of the simulations aren't outstanding enough. According to my calculations and experiments, the special effect of the flying dragon sword technique's muscles and bones, as well as the darkness slaying sword's overdraft potential, only has a 10% chance of changing its form. I can consider combining it with other sword techniques. During this period of time, Hops have been searching for a new synthesis formula, a new sword technique that could increase the knight's aerial combat abilities. However, after failing several hundred times in a row, he felt a little tired. Hops was a little hesitant as to whether he should invest money and time into synthesizing the flying dragon sword technique into the darkness slaying sword, completing the special effect of changing its form, and then synthesizing it with other techniques to achieve the desired result. This was the importance of the person in charge of the research team. They would judge the direction, target, and process of the research based on their own experience, realm, and cultivation. However, when it came to research, there would always be more failures than successes. In history, the birth of many powerful techniques was the result of many trials and errors. Hops shook his head, no longer thinking about these problems. He stood up and headed out, planning to relax. Passing by many research rooms, Hops observed the progress of his subordinates. Some people were comparing the various parameters of different sword techniques at different levels, determining the growth curve of the techniques. Some people were comparing the effects of slight differences in the human body structure to various sword techniques when they had the same aptitude. These were all people Hops had set up himself. After all, he had to grasp the general direction, and it was impossible for him to always do all sorts of trivial things, such as collecting data and repeating experiments. Just then, he passed by Leon, who was reading the secret manual of the rebirth sword technique written by Fangxingjian. Leon's eyes were filled with contempt and impatience. Over the past few days, he had been reading through this secret manual written by Fangxingjian, and he had also compared it with the information in the library. He had ascertained that there was no such sword technique in the Empire, but he still felt that Fangxingjian's sword technique was just a product that had been pieced together from different places. But it's really considered a new sword technique. I'll just register it for him. After all, if others were to see it, he'd only be embarrassing himself. Just as Leon was thinking of this, Hops had already appeared behind him. Leon immediately stood up, bowed, and said, "Teacher." Hops threw a glance at the secret manual in Leon's hands, took it over, and asked, "What's this?" Leon said, "A newly created nurturing sword technique." As if trying to disassociate himself from this, Leon added, "It was written by a new student randomly, forcefully piecing together a bunch of sword techniques. However, the force has been sorted out, and the moves can be linked together. I had wanted to register it for him. But looking at it now, I still feel that it's a great disgrace to our great Western region." Before he could finish his words, he realized that Hops was staring at the rebirth sword technique in a daze. At the start, when Hops saw the introduction, his eyes were filled with disdain. What did it mean by combining the strengths of countless sword techniques and having an effect that was over 100 times better than ordinary nurturing sword techniques? He had read on with the intention of watching a joke. However, after reading a few more pages, Hops's gaze became filled with doubt and astonishment. 10 minutes later, Hops was still reading the rebirth sword technique. His gaze was filled with a grim look. He realized that this was a sword technique that was worth reading and toying with in detail. Half an hour later, Hops sat in Leon's seat, still reading the rebirth sword technique in his hands. His expression was unreadable, but Leon's face was filled with perplexity. Another half an hour later, another student came and said, "Teacher, the new data for the killing sword is out. We've made a new discovery. Go back and wait for me for a while," Hops said casually. This lasted for an entire hour, and that student came 3 times. However, he was sent away by Hops each time. 5 minutes later, Hops raised his head, looked at Leon, and asked, "Who was the one who brought this sword technique?" It's Fangxingjian, the regional champion in this year's regional selection." Fangxingjian. A thought flashed through Hops's mind, and the image of that young man who had rejected his invitation flashed once again. So it's him. At the next moment, Hops's face relaxed, and he revealed a smile that he had not revealed for a very long time. "Where is he?" "Asked him to come over." "Forget it. I'll go look for him." With that, Hops pulled Leon along and walked over. There was a hint of eagerness in his eyes. Chapter 270. The Sacred Land with 50 times the ether particle density. Zhou Xingwen stood there, looking toward the depths of the Sacred Land. Various schemes flashed in his eyes, as if he was waiting for someone. However, after a while, a figure slowly walked toward where he was. It was a man with black hair and eyes, dressed in formal attire, and exuding an unruly and elegant disposition. He was the 9th in the academy, level 26 conferred knight Wang Tiangang. Right now, Wang Tiangang was filled with confidence and experience. To be able to become one of the top 10 in the regional academy at the age of 35, he could be considered a young talent with a bright future ahead of him. He would have at least 20 to 30 years to strive for the divine level. Therefore, his face was filled with confidence. Looking at Zhou Xingwen, he said calmly, "It's been half a month. You still haven't settled it?" Zhou Xingwen smiled bitterly and said, "Brother Tiangang, that Fangxingjian is too tight-lipped. It's hard to negotiate a price with him. Moreover, He's only come out twice in so many days. Moreover, he's a cultivation maniac. It's not easy to look for him even once. Wang Tiangang frowned. As the ninth in the academy, he was very confident. However, how could he not want to challenge the top 8? However, he might need to have confidence to challenge them. This was especially so when there was only 1 year left before the national selection. Everyone was crazily unleashing their potential. In order to stand out in such a competition, he would need more advantages. For example, a cultivation ground with 100 times the ether particle density. With this as a foundation, he believed that he would be able to enter the top 5 in a year's time. He might even be able to shake the top 3 monsters. However, Fang Xingjian was asking for 1 million gold. To Wang Tiangang, this was simply asking for a sky-high price. It was impossible for him to pay 1 million gold. As for the other 15 people in the sacred land with 100 times density, each of them was more experienced and had more powerful backgrounds. Other than the top 8 in the academy, the remaining 7 were all masters in the academy. None of them could be replaced by Wang Tiangang. It was only newcomers like Fang Xingjian that Wang Tiangang would pay attention to. However, it was impossible for him to go head-on. Hearing Zhou Xingwen's words, Wang Tiangang frowned and said, "What did he do after coming out?" Zhou Xingwen said, "The first time was to meet a few of my friends, and the second time was to register my sword arts." Wang Tiangang was surprised. Registering sword techniques? He created his own killing technique? Regardless of the method used, it was not an easy task to create one's own sword technique. It required a certain level of attainment in sword techniques. Wang Tiangang had also thought of creating his own sword technique, but he had never succeeded. Zhou Xingwen shook his head and said, "It's a nurturing technique." Wang Tiangang nodded in understanding. So it was a set of nurturing sword techniques. He could create a few sets of nurturing sword techniques anytime and anywhere. After all, they were martial techniques used to train and maintain the physical body. For a conferred knight like him, it would be easy for him to create a few sets of methods to train the physical body. Nurturing sword techniques? Then it's nothing. Wang Tiangang said, "If it really doesn't work out, I'll lure him out again in a few days." Wait a minute. You said that he created a nurturing technique and when to register it? He likes to be famous? Maybe. Zhou Xingwen had also thought about this in private. But I've seen that set of sword technique of his. It's a patchwork of many things, and it's nothing much. It'll probably be quite difficult for him to become famous with this. Let's not think too much about it. It's already been dragging on for too long. I've applied to teacher to pay a visit to Fang Xingjian. I can stay in the 100 times area for half an hour. Come with me. This time around, we must get this done. Just as the two of them were conversing, another 2 people came flying over along the small path. Almost with a strong gust of wind, an elderly man appeared before Zhou Xingwen and Wang Tiangang, dragging a man who was as wild as a lion. It was Hops, who was unkempt, and Leon, who had been dragged here by him. Seeing Wang Tiangang, Hops suddenly came to a stop. As he stopped, the strong gust of wind, the falling leaves, and the soaring dust all came to a stop in that instant, displaying a mysterious change. When Wang Tiangang saw Hops, he immediately bowed and said, "Master Hops, why have you come to the sacred land?" His impression of Hops was that this Master Hops was obsessed with sword arts and would usually not cultivate in the sacred land. Instead, he would be in the laboratory outside, continuously researching newer and stronger sword techniques. Hearing Wang Tiangang's words, Hops took a good look at Wang Tiangang before saying, "Oh, Wang Tiangang?" He then immediately asked, "Did you see Fang Xingjian coming out?" "Fang Xingjian?" Wang Tiangang frowned and said, "I didn't see him. Is there something you need from him?" He suddenly had a bad premonition. Didn't he create a set of sword technique? Hop said, "I have many questions to ask him about this set of sword technique. It's good that you didn't see him. There is only one path leading out of the sacred land." Since Wang Tiangang did not see Fang Xingjian, it meant that he was still inside. With that, Hops took a step forward, and the wind and clouds gathered once again. The strong gales, fallen leaves, and dust that had stopped earlier once again dashed out together with his body, leaving behind a baffled Wang Tiangang. Wang Tiangang frowned and said, "Master Hops is looking for Fang Xingjian." Zhou Xingwen looked in the direction of the depths of the sacred land and said, "Let's follow him and take a look as well." As a master in the academy, Hops had extremely high levels of authority. Even though he was bringing Leon along, he was still able to pass through without any obstructions. In the blink of an eye, he had arrived before Fang Xingjian's cultivation house. Right now, Fang Xingjian had already completed the luminous heaven soaring slash and pushed this sword technique to level 40. He now possessed the ability to change the frequency of his sword light, releasing various colors of light, and even to the point where light could not be seen. Although Fang Xingjian did not focus on practicing the nine-headed dragon sword technique, he had been tempering his potential every day ever since he had transitioned. After a few days, he had already reached level 40, increasing the efficiency of tempering his attributes and shortening the amount of time he needed to practice. Right now, Fang Xingjian was holding a pen and paper, writing down the final outline of his book. He was waiting to send out the next day so that Ferdinand could get someone to write it up and then print it to sell for money. However, just then, a voice rang out. "Is Fang Xingjian around? I'm Hops. I'd like to talk to you about the registration of your newly created sword technique." Hearing the words Hops, the image of that unkempt old man who paid no attention to worldly matters and focused on his sword arts once again appeared in Fang Xingjian's mind. He opened the door and saw that Hops was holding on to Leon, standing at the entrance. When Hops saw Fang Xingjian coming out, he grabbed onto Fang Xingjian's shoulder and asked, "Rebirth sword technique. You created this sword technique yourself?" "That's right." Fang Xingjian lifted his head and saw that Wang Tiangang and Zhou Xingwen were also walking over from afar. The sacred land was not a big place for conferred knights, so they were able to catch up to Hops easily. Hops stared at Fang Xingjian and said, "How are the effects of this sword technique? How much potential can it produce at level 10? Chapter 271. By now, when he saw how impatient his teacher was, Leon knew that he had made an error in judgment. Not only was Fang Xingjian's rebirth sword technique not a trashy technique, but it could also be a very outstanding nurturing sword technique. Usually, when it came to the approval and registration of new sword techniques in the Great Western Regional Academy, Leon would be the first to do it. When he saw a sword technique that was more outstanding, he would then recommend it to his teacher, Hops. After passing this stage, the sword technique would then be submitted to the Knight Association in the Empire's capital. Once the Knight Association passed it, the new sword technique would be entered into the association's sword arts library and published in the Knight's Handbook. It would then be distributed to every Royal Academy, as well as the various departments in the Empire, for them to peruse and then decide if they should purchase it. Of course, these people would also be able to learn the new sword technique for free during this process. There would be no need to charge for this, as there was no need for it. If there were to be a need to charge for the channels between high-end experts and researchers, not only would there not be much profit, but it would also slow down the development of martial techniques. It was just that most of them were extremely busy and rarely would they have the time to learn new techniques, unless the new technique was extremely outstanding and suited them very well. When Leon heard his teacher's question, he also looked at Fang Xingjian curiously. He was also very puzzled as to what was so amazing about this sword technique that he had pieced together. Behind Hops, Wang Tiangang also walked over. After hearing Hops' question, both he and Zhou Xingwen immediately understood. Hops had taken a liking to Fang Xingjian's self-created sword technique. The two of them could not help but exchange a glance, feeling curious as to what was so amazing about this rebirth sword technique to be able to make a master come looking for it so anxiously. Fang Xingjian did not plan on hiding much either. He had wanted to sell this sword technique to begin with, so naturally he hoped that more people would know how amazing the rebirth sword technique was. Moreover, after others started cultivating it, they would gradually discover how powerful it was. Therefore, he deliberated over his words and said, I have some specialties that can increase one's potential. Therefore, it's not easy for me to judge how much potential ordinary people would have if they were to cultivate the rebirth sword technique. However, it should be around 4,000 to 5,000 points. 5,000 points? Leon's eyeballs almost popped out, and he subconsciously criticized, "Do you know that even the most outstanding nurturing sword techniques can only provide 800 potential points per day at level 10? You're talking about 5,000 points. What kind of joke is that?" He turned to look at his teacher and said, "Teacher, this is impossible." However, he saw that Hops was neither astonished nor furious. Hops merely stroked his chin and said, 5,000 points. Leon felt that something was off. Could it be that teacher really believed that there was a nurturing sword technique that could provide him with 5,000 potential points every day? When ordinary people cultivated ordinary level 10 sword techniques, they would only gain several tens to over 100 potential points every day. It was already very amazing for a set of sword techniques to gain 800 potential points. This was a miracle created by the Southern Flame Regional Academy's Sword Arts team. Clan was still in disbelief. 5,000 points? How is that possible? Hops looked at Fong Xingjian with great interest, his eyes blinking like the stars in the sky. He did not say whether he believed that Fong Xingjian had 5,000 points or not. He only said, "This rebirth sword technique is really interesting. I saw many traces of sword techniques. At the start, I thought that you were just putting them together randomly, but later on, I realized that that wasn't the case. Every move, every stance, and every movement of force circulation were perfectly integrated together. If you were to put them together, they would have been put together perfectly. It's as if you've used a fusion method to extract the essence of many sword techniques and recreate a new set of sword techniques. If this rebirth sword technique were to be synthesized, it would probably require a lot of sword techniques to be synthesized, right?" Fong Xingjian was prepared for this and said, "That's right. I've integrated a total of 30 sets of nurturing sword techniques for this rebirth sword technique." Although he had greatly reduced the actual number, it still gave everyone a shock. Leon said in disbelief, 30 sets of nurturing sword techniques? Could it be that you've reached the maximum level? Fong Xingjian nodded. Leon, Wang Tiangang, and the others all fell silent. What kind of concept was reaching the maximum level for 30 sets of nurturing sword techniques? It was something that ordinary people would not be able to achieve in their entire lives. Even with Leon's and Wang Tiangang's aptitude, they would probably need 20 years of wholeheartedly cultivating these 30 sets of sword techniques before they would be able to reach the maximum level for all of them. This was too unbelievable. Although Fong Xingjian did not seem to be lying, they still found it hard to believe. Just then, Hop smiled. Amazing. As expected of a genius who has comprehended all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries. You're only 17 this year, right? To think that you've already mastered 30 sets of nurturing sword techniques and created this rebirth sword technique. I've only calculated it carefully from your secret manual and felt that this nurturing sword technique should increase a lot of potential. However, I didn't expect it to be as much as 5,000 points. I still need to confirm this. 5,000 points. It'll be too shocking if word of it gets out. When the others heard Hop's words, their gazes were filled with a hint of understanding. That was right. For a genius who had comprehended all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries, it was not surprising for him to have such a result. This was especially so for Leon. He recalled that the information regarding Fong Xingjian was something he had obtained from Hops earlier on the way here. Right now, he had subconsciously overlooked it. There was no helping it. 30 sets of nurturing sword techniques that had reached the maximum level were too eye-catching. However, compared to the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries, it did not seem as astonishing. Hops immediately pulled Fong Xingjian aside and asked, "There are traces of sword techniques from the School of Sword Arts. I'd like to ask you how you managed to integrate the grizzly bear sword technique and the eagle sword technique. Their concepts are a little different, right?" Fang Xingjian said directly. I just performed them together. Performed them together? Hops was confused and continued to ask. Then what about the high mountain sword technique and the universal sweep? I just performed them together. Fang Xingjian did not plan on discussing too much theory with Hops. He said directly, I just performed them together on my body. Hops was stunned for a moment before he suddenly thought, could this be the method of geniuses? He had always been called a genius since he was young, but today he had met someone who was even more monstrous. Hops and Fang Xingjian were still conversing when Wang Tiangang walked up to Leon and asked, can you let me take a look? Leon threw a glance at Wang Tiangang. Faced with this conferred knight whose ranking was far above his, if it were any other time, Leon would definitely greet him politely. However, he did not do so today. He was still immersed in the great astonishment Fang Xingjian had brought him. Wang Tiangang took over Fang Xingjian's secret manual and started scanning through it. To be honest, he was not like Leon, who followed Hops blindly and trusted Hops' judgment. Therefore, when he was looking at the rebirth sword technique, he had wanted to look at it with a critical gaze. Therefore, right from the start, he had only scanned through it once, wanted to find faults. Therefore, after scanning through it once, he started looking at it in detail from the beginning. Wang Tiangong's expression turned increasingly grim. Leon, who was at the side, still wore a puzzled expression. 5,000 potential points. Let alone 5,000, even 3,000 potential points will be able to change the entire situation in the world, right? Is that really possible? Chapter 272. The more he looked at the rebirth sword technique, the more astonished Wang Tiangang was. He was ranked 9th in the academy, far above Leon, who was ranked 17th. Naturally, his sword arts were more exquisite. This was why he was able to tell how extraordinary the rebirth sword technique was, just like Hops. This was clearly a nurturing sword technique that had the essences of countless sword arts integrated together. Although each move and stance seemed to have been pieced together, they actually contained the profoundness of several different sword moves. It was as if it was nurturing the body in a way that pushed the limits of the human body. Any more would result in the destruction of the body, and any less would be an ordinary nurturing sword technique. It was also because of this that he could deeply sense how difficult it was to create this sword technique. He lifted his head to look at Fang Xingjian once again, especially when he saw the other party's young face. He was only 17 years old. Thinking of how he himself was 35 years old, he could not suppress the flames of jealousy burning within him. Why wasn't I the one who created this sword technique? Even if he were to add up all the nurturing techniques he practiced every day, he would only be able to gain over 4,000 potential points per day. However, to think that Fang Xingjian's rebirth sword technique would be able to gain 5,000 potential points. No, it was not just 5,000 points. It was because Fang Xingjian would have the enhancement from specialties. Moreover, the highest level of his sword technique would definitely not be level 10. Thinking of this, Wang Tiangang felt even more depressed. Thankfully, he did not know that Fang Xingjian was gaining 30,000 potential points per day. If he knew, he would probably want to stab Fang Xingjian to death. This was also the reason why Fang Xingjian did not reveal it. After all, being one step ahead would only cause others to be envious and jealous. Being 100 steps ahead could cause others to feel despair or even go crazy. Zhou Xingwen walked up and asked, "What's the matter?" Wang Tiangang let out a breath, shook his head, and left without saying a word. Ever since he was young, he had always relied on his absolute advantage and talent to crush the other knights, enjoying the thrill of bullying the weak. However, this time around, he finally enjoyed the same feeling as his companions since he was young, the feeling of being completely dominated by others with their talent. It was an extremely unpleasant feeling. He suddenly felt grateful to the seniors that he had surpassed since he was young for not slapping him to death. Seeing that Wang Tiangang had left, Zhou Xingwen stayed behind. His eyes rolled as he looked at Fang Xingjian. No one knew what he was thinking. Hops was still discussing with Fang Xingjian nonstop. From the initial circulation of force, to the trembling of the organs, and then to the circulation of vital energy and blood. Right now, Ryan could no longer understand what they were saying. If it could be said that at the beginning, Taya would still be able to understand and follow along with some difficulty. However, now that she was listening to Hop's and Feng Xingjian's discussion, she felt as if she was listening to a book from the heavens. He could recognize each word, but he couldn't understand them when they were strung together. If he had been to Earth, he would know that there was a saying that could describe his current state. Although he didn't understand, he felt that it was amazing. This feeling made him feel even more respect than if he had understood. He waited at the side and watched as Feng Xingjian and Hops communicated for over an hour before Hop smiled and said, "I didn't expect that you've already gained such a deep understanding of nurturing sword arts, as well as the human body's flesh, blood, vital energy, and blood. How about it? Are you interested in joining my sword arts team?" Hops invited him once again. Seeing this scene, what else could Leon say? He could only look at Feng Xingjian in admiration. The disdain and contempt he had felt toward Feng Xingjian had long since been tossed to the back of his mind. Feng Xingjian was once again invited, but he still did not plan on joining. He had his own plans and did not plan on becoming Hop's subordinate. Seeing that Feng Xingjian was shaking his head in rejection, Hops did not feel awkward at all. Instead, he smiled and said, "Xingjian, you might not understand. Pursuing sword arts, pursuing the pinnacle of martial arts, requires a lot of time and money. My sword arts team will receive at least 300,000 gold every year from the regional academy. I can give you 50,000 gold to let you explore sword arts. Of course, you'll have to get my approval for the direction of your research." Hops really admired Feng Xingjian's talent and could not help but want to give him a hand. To think that a sword arts research team in the regional academy would receive 300,000 gold every year, which was more than double that of Cursed Royal Academy. From this, one could tell how great the difference between a prefectural academy and a regional academy was. It was like the difference between a high school and a university. When Leon heard this, he looked at Feng Xingjian with his mouth dry up. 50,000 gold a year was a huge sum to him. It should be said that it was a huge sum to any conferred knight below level 25. However, Feng Xingjian still shook his head and said, "There's no need for that. I don't wish to join any research team for now." Hops shook his head in pity and did not continue to press him. He merely said, "I'll report your rebirth sword technique to the Knight Association. If you hurry up and put it into practice, you should be able to see it in the Knight's Handbook at the end of this month." "Oh, right. What's your reference price?" "It's the reference price for the authorization." Hops then smiled. "I'm very optimistic about the future of this sword technique of yours. Putting aside the few academies, a few departments in the military and local troops will all be interested in buying it. The exact price for the authorization would have to be discussed one by one." Feng Xingjian planned to leave this matter to Ferdinand. However, he could write down the reference price given by the author in the Knight's Handbook, so that those who wanted to buy it would have a better idea. Feng Xingjian gave it some thought and said, "What do you think about 3,000 gold a year?" Hearing that it was 3,000 gold a year, Leon could not help but gasp. How could this be considered expensive? The annual authorization fee for ordinary killing techniques would only be a few hundred gold. How expensive was 3,000 gold? If 20 academies were to purchase it, then Feng Xingjian's annual income would be 60,000 gold. It was even more than what Hops had transferred to him earlier. Of course, the prerequisite was that there were really people who were willing to pay so much money for it. Hops stroked his beard, which he had not shaved for a very long time, and said, "Haha, it's a little expensive, but you can talk to them when the time comes. However, if you wish to be recognized earlier, it's best that you lower the price. Otherwise, even if you get recognized in theory, there won't be any practical effects. Many people will still be unwilling to buy it easily." Feng Xingjian understood this. Even if the Knight Association's evaluation team acknowledged the effects of the rebirth sword technique in theory, it would still have to be practiced by a group of people and there would be real effects. Only then would the rebirth sword technique really become popular. After sending off Hops and the envious Leon, Feng Xingjian returned to his room. Without needing to adjust his mental state, He continued to write the last few sentences in the book and then started to practice the 90,000 godly demon flash. He appeared as if he had not been affected by hops and his countless future earnings. He was neither flustered nor arrogant. Ever since he had become a conferred knight, his universal sword dominance lunisolar mental cultivation method had continued to circulate. It seemed as if he had become increasingly calm. It was as if he had accumulated emotions such as fury and hatred. Once he encountered external demons and felt aggrieved, it would be like a sharp sword being unsheathed, erupting forth in an instant. After cultivating and sorting out his techniques for the past few days, they had become Boundaries Negation, Level 40 Rebirth Sword Technique, Level 40 New 9-Headed Dragon Sword Technique, Level 40 Luminous Heaven Soaring Slash, Level 4 Ether Sword Ripples, Level 1 90,000 Godly Demon Flash. Other than the Ether Divine Art and the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash, they had all reached the maximum level. The next step was to raise the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash to the maximum level and then synthesize them. Chapter 273. Next, the Rebirth Sword Technique would be reported to the Knight Association, and it would probably appear in the Knight's Handbook at the end of the month. Then, the various headmasters and department heads would gradually realize how powerful the Rebirth Sword Technique was and start to purchase this sword technique. It would probably take a very long time for this matter to ferment. Therefore, while the Rebirth Sword Technique might bring great returns, it would probably not be able to help Feng Xingjian within a short period of time. Right now, Feng Xingjian still had to focus on cultivating the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash, and then publish a book to earn money while the regional champion was still in the limelight. Therefore, after Feng Xingjian spent an entire night cultivating the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash to level 9, he once again headed to the hotel where Ferdinand was staying the next morning. However, when he arrived at the hotel, he found out that Ferdinand and the others were no longer staying there. Following the address that Ferdinand had left behind, Feng Xingjian arrived at a 2-story building in the southwest corner of the Great Western City. There was a small garden of about 20 square meters outside the building, and it was a typical European-style bungalow. It looked like it had been built only a few years ago. Ferdinand opened the door and came out to welcome Feng Xingjian, saying, "This place isn't bad, right? I don't think we can keep staying in a hotel. It just so happens that I won a huge sum of money from the regional champion this time around. Since I have nothing better to do, I bought this house. This house originally belonged to a knight from the Great Western City. He wanted to be transferred to the Southern Flame region and was in a hurry to leave, so I sold it at the lowest price, only 800 gold. As he spoke, he had already led Feng Xingjian into the hall of the house. Feng Xingjian stepped onto the furry carpet and sat on the genuine leather sofa, as if he would sink into it. There would be maids serving drinks and snacks at all times, and there were ice cubes that were half a meter tall placed in every corner of the room, emitting waves of cold air. One would not be able to feel the summer heat at all. Feng Xingjian sighed and said, "You really know how to enjoy life." Ferdinand smiled. "I can't mistreat myself when I'm rich. How's the progress on your side?" Robert and Anthony also walked over, looking at Feng Xingjian in anticipation. Feng Xingjian took out the outline that he had written. On it was the process of his own cultivation, as well as the main points of his usual cultivation of basic sword techniques. Ferdinand took the book and started flipping through it. Feng Xingjian asked, "Oh right, do we need the approval of the Empire's government to sell books? Also, how do you print them?" These are the two questions that he had always been puzzled by, but did not know the answer to. Ferdinand looked at the document and nodded occasionally. At the same time, he said to Feng Xingjian, "Approved? It's just selling books. What's there to approve? At most, they would have to pay some taxes to the city government. They would either engage in guerrilla warfare or give them some benefits. Then, they would not have to pay any taxes. As for printing, we can use type printing. Speaking of which, I have to thank the second prince. If it wasn't for him gathering a group of people to invent paper and printing, it would be troublesome." After asking in detail, Feng Xingjian found out that in the past, There had also been paper and printing in Miracle World. However, they had all been the most basic wooden-type printing, as well as very coarse papyrus. Later on, it was the second prince who led the reforms, which led to the current type printing and higher quality white paper. This had greatly sped up the dissemination of documents and culture within the empire. Is the second prince trying to use Earth's modern technology to slowly change the entire country? But when faced with the first prince's absolute violence, such a method is too slow. Fang Xingjian was thinking about the second prince's question when Ferdinand said, "The story is too simple. I'll get someone to change it for you. I won't touch the insights. I still believe in your sword art standards." "Change the story." Ferdinand grinned and said, "It's just a little more complicated. The superiors, teachers, and even the foreigners look down on you. Then the student proves his excellence by himself. Everyone likes to read stories like that." Fang Xingjian frowned. Although he did not like it when his story was made up, earning money was more important. Therefore, he could only say, "Don't go overboard with the story. Don't worry, I'll definitely make your image look great." Ferdinand smiled again. A down-and-out knight becomes a genius, soaring up to the skies, shocking the world with a single feat after becoming famous. He is neither arrogant nor rash, and falls in love at first sight with a commoner lady. The maids in my previous residence all liked to read such novels. Fang Xingjian said calmly. Also, I've already registered a new nurturing sword technique. When the time comes, you'll organize it. If anyone comes to purchase it, I'll get them to look for you here. Ferdinand nodded, his eyes still focused on the book written by Fang Xingjian. He did not really pay much attention to the new sword technique. It was not easy to sell a nurturing sword technique, and it's such a high price at that. Usually, it was a big shot, an expert, or an entire academy who had spent a huge amount of time and money to come up with a new sword technique after much difficulty. After all, the creation of a nurturing sword technique was a type of basic research that had been tempered and refined by countless generations of people. The price to pay for even the slightest bit of improvement would be too great. However, Ferdinand had another thought. He lifted his head and looked at Fang Xingjian, saying, "Xingjian, your talent is very strong now, and your learning speed is very fast, right?" Fang Xingjian was asking a question he already knew the answer to. To be able to comprehend the 7th level of the Pantheon Monument, there was no need to doubt his talent and learning ability. Fang Xingjian looked at him and nodded. Ferdinand then asked, "Then what's the level 29 armor that the Academy has rewarded you with? Is a full set of armor? Its defense must be very strong, right? And roughly, when will you be able to complete the second transition?" Hearing his series of questions, Fang Xingjian said, "Just say what you want to say. I'm hoping that before I sell the book, you can gain some fame for yourself. I heard that in your regional academy, the ordinary killing techniques are all in the library, while the compulsory killing techniques for each department are in the Killing Techniques Palace." Killing Techniques Palace. Fang Xingjian frowned. Even he himself had not understood this, but now, Ferdinand, an outsider, was explaining it to him. The regional academy had various courses, and one of them was the Killing Techniques course. It required every student to learn the compulsory killing techniques for their department. These killing techniques were in the Killing Techniques Palace. For example, in the Sword Arts department that Fang Xingjian was in, there were 4 sets of killing techniques in the Killing Techniques Palace, which one had to continuously level up to learn. Ferdinand said, "I'm not too sure about the specific learning process in the Killing Techniques Palace, but I think that with your talent, you'll probably be able to break another record in the regional academy. By then, it'll be easier for you to sell your books." He smiled and said, "First comprehending the Pantheon Monument, then breaking through the Killing Techniques Palace, an unrivaled genius breaking records consecutively, shocking the Empire's upper echelon, and dominating the regional academy. What's the secret behind his success? It's all in this book." How attractive would such a title be? How many people would buy this book? Anthony pinched his chin and said, "Wouldn't it offend too many people? If this was really written in the book, he would probably offend a whole bunch of students in the academy." Ferdinand let out a cold laugh. Offend people? The prefectural selection selects 10 out of hundreds or even thousands of people. The regional selection selects 10 out of several hundred people, and the national selection selects 10 out of 80 people. Every champion has to fight their way out of thousands of people. There's a limit to the resources in this world. If you want to get anything, you'll have to rely on yourself to fight for it. Only those who are weak and have mediocre aptitude would be afraid of offending others. It's because they would not be able to win against others. As for those who succeed, which genius would be afraid of offending others? If you want to get first place and get the most resources, you'll naturally have to snatch what others have. The more resources you have, the less resources others have. If you're afraid of offending others, you'll just have to wait for your entire life to be mediocre. After saying that, he looked at Xingjian and said, Xingjian, right? Chapter 274. Fang Xingjian nodded and said, up to you. Just don't go overboard. With that, he stood up and headed for the door. He had said what he needed to say, and it was time for him to return to the sacred land to cultivate. In fact, if not for the fact that he needed a huge sum of money to prepare for the mystical prince in order to increase his cultivation speed, he could have stayed in the sacred land until his killing techniques reached the maximum level before coming out. Ferdinand and the others had long gotten used to Fang Xingjian's fanaticism for cultivation and did not ask him to stay. Just like that, Fang Xingjian returned to the sacred land and continued with a monotonous routine of eating, cultivating, eating, and cultivating. Monotonous, boring, and lonely, practicing the 90,000 godly demon flashes moves over and over again. Even though Fang Xingjian had the world's top sword arts talent, he still needed to put in a tremendous amount of effort in order to succeed. In the process of putting in effort, he had to endure the boredom and loneliness. It could be said that cultivation was never a pleasant thing. Only by enduring through the endless hardships and succeeding in the cultivation, such as when one's technique leveled up, would one be able to feel a sense of satisfaction. The entire process was a process of pain, then satisfaction, and then pain again. As his cultivation continued, Fang Xingjian realized that his ether synchronization rate had also increased to 13%. This was much faster than what he had expected. With the increase of 3%, the amount of information he was able to receive was much more varied and huge. This also allowed him to see more things within a 10-meter radius of his heaven's perception. Fang Xingjian's fingers stroked the air, as if he could sense the restlessness flowing through it. He could sense various auras of anger, despair, and loneliness. These are the emotions left behind by the cultivators here. Fang Xingjian looked at his palm. It was as if he could sense that it was encompassed by countless substances, but he could not see what they were. He could only vaguely deduce that they should be air, radiation, waves, or even ether particles. This cultivation speed isn't bad. In half a month, his ether synchronization rate had increased by 3%. Then in 1 or 2 months, he would be able to increase it by 10%. This was something that ordinary conferred knights would only be able to achieve in 1 or 2 years. This was the sacred land with 100 times the density. In addition to his specialty darkness sword sense, as well as his world's top sword arts talent, he was able to increase the ether particle density at a rate several hundred times that of ordinary people. Of course, Fang Xingjian was blind. This was also because he had to rely on his heaven's perception to sense everything. Even though several hundred times sounded like a lot, in comparison, some people would still be unable to break through to the night realm even after 50 years. Some people had already reached the legendary divine level after 50 years. The efficiency of this could be described as several hundred times that of a normal person. Moreover, increasing his ether synchronization rate by 10% in 1 or 2 months was still too slow for Fang Xingjian. He was going to participate in the national selection a year later and even go up against the first prince. However, such things could not be rushed. Fang Xingjian cultivated the 90,000 godly demon flash for another day, pushing this sword technique to level 23. At level 10, the 90,000 godly demon flash allowed him to create 9 shadows with one sword. With each move, he could create 9 godly demon clones, and he could maintain a maximum of 99 clones. At level 20, the special effect evolved once again, becoming one sword that allowed him to create 19 shadows with a maximum of 299 clones. With over 100 godly demon clones that looked like real people, they could even exchange positions with Feng Xingjian. The 90,000 godly demon flash was indeed a combination of attack and defense. It was the best move for tangling and probing. Feng Xingjian was looking forward to the combined effect of the 90,000 godly demon flash and the luminous heaven-soaring slash. Early the next morning, Feng Xingjian decided to go out and listen to the lessons in the regional academy to change his mind and gain some experience. He also wanted to see what the Killing Techniques Palace was like. Based on his deductions, the Killing Techniques Palace in the Sword Arts Department should have some killing techniques unique to the Sword Arts Department. After leaving the Sacred Land, Feng Xingjian found a random servant and asked for the location of the teaching block. Then he headed toward the teaching block. It was like the Roman temple, with countless huge stone pillars supporting it. However, not all the lessons were held in the teaching block. When Feng Xingjian arrived at the teaching block, he discovered that other than the ranking board, there was also a lesson timetable at the entrance. It recorded the time and location of all the lessons for the week. In the teaching block, a lesson was also going on. A female conferred knight was standing in the middle of the hall, surrounded by 6 other conferred knights. They were either sitting, standing, or lying down. It was as if they were having an ordinary discussion. The female conferred knight in the middle had beautiful long hair. She was wearing a knight attire and a crimson cape. Her skin was tender, and she had a relaxed expression. She had an elegant and noble disposition. She stood in the middle of the hall and said, "The most important thing for a knight's cultivation is to keep on increasing your ether synchronization rate. As your ether synchronization rate increases, you'll be able to obtain more information and exchange more energy. Regardless of whether it's your own insight, talent, or understanding of nature, all of them will get deeper and deeper. The prowess of your killing techniques will also get stronger and stronger. However, this is a gradual process. You'll need to slowly hone your will and carefully come into contact with the information from the outside world. It's because the human body has its limits. If you accept a tremendous amount of information too early, your consciousness will be unable to accept it and you'll be injured. You might go crazy, lose your memories, or even become a living dead. When a conferred knight's ether synchronization rate reaches 20%, they'll be able to sense other people's emotions. When it reaches 30%, they'll be able to see light and sound. At this stage, they'll be able to channel their information into physical objects and other living things. Therefore, a method of attacking others has been created. It's to channel your own memories and will into other people's bodies, brainwashing them, or even turning them into your puppet temporarily. This is called willpower impact. When knights attack ordinary people, they'll be invincible once their reduced force field is activated. As for us conferred knights, we can directly use heaven's perception to carry out willpower impacts. What I'm going to teach you today is how to fend off such attacks. Just as the female knight was speaking, another lady walked up to Feng Xingjian. It was Rhoda, who was also from Cursed Academy. She looked at this regional champion with curiosity and asked in a soft voice, "Why haven't I seen you around?" Although Rhoda was wearing ordinary training clothes, it still could not hide her slender and well-proportioned figure. She looked like a beautiful snake, and it could be said that other than the female knight who was teaching, she was the one that the males present were looking at the most. "I'm cultivating," Feng Xingjian said casually. Rhoda blinked and asked, "I heard that you've obtained the Sacred Land with 100 times the density? How do you feel?" On the other side, a short, fat, and stocky man who looked like a block of marble threw a dissatisfied glance at Feng Xingjian. Seeing how close Rhoda was to him, he felt even more displeased. His name was Titan, and he was a level 22 conferred knight who was ranked in the 40th place. Ever since he had met Rhoda, he had been greatly astonished. After knowing that her performance in the regional selection had allowed her to gain the favor of the melancholic monarch, and that she was halfway to attaining heaven's perception, His attitude towards Rhoda had become even warmer. However, no matter how warm he'd been, Rhoda had always treated him half-coldly. Now, seeing how close Rhoda was to Feng Xingjian, he was infuriated. In particular, Feng Xingjian's tall and slender body, as well as his elegant and otherworldly disposition, made him feel even more displeased. Finally, after the female teacher had finished speaking, he suddenly shouted, "Teacher Angelina, there's no point in just talking. Why don't we demonstrate it on the spot? Willpower impact. This is something that some of the newbies here have not come into contact with before." Chapter 275. Hearing Titan's words, the female teacher who was known as Angelina gave it some thought before nodding and saying, "What you said makes sense. There are a few new faces among the students here today. Are they the newcomers for the regional selection this time around?" With that, everyone looked toward Feng Xingjian and Rhoda. Angelina smiled and said, "That's true. No matter how much we talk, it's better to exchange blows with an expert. This is especially so when it comes to willpower impacts. It's an exchange of the mind. If you don't experience it for yourself, you'll never be able to understand it. If you want to enter the sacred land in the future, you'll also need to get used to the invasion of information currents like willpower impacts." Suddenly, she clapped her hands and said, "Oh, right. You guys haven't gone through the second transition yet, right? That's great. With a conferred knight personally channeling information into you, it can increase the success rate of your heaven's perception." This teacher by the name of Angelina appeared mature and charming, but in reality, she was a little silly and adorable. As a genius and a young lady from an aristocratic family, she had been carefully taken care of from a young age. She had never encountered any scheming or scheming, and after joining the regional academy as a teacher, she had mostly been immersed in her studies and research. She was a typical geek. It was true that Rhoda had not gone through the second transition, and she had not even fully attained heaven's perception. As for Feng Xingjian, he had not told anyone that he had completed the second transition. However, Rhoda naturally wanted to give it a try, while Feng Xingjian also wanted to understand what was going on with the willpower impacts of conferred knights. He wanted to know if it was similar to the time when he had fended off Damarov. Seeing that both of them had nodded in agreement, Titan immediately stood up, looked at Feng Xingjian, and walked up. He patted Feng Xingjian's shoulder and said as if he had been through it, "Haha, Junior, you haven't gone through willpower impacts before, right? Let me guide you. Don't worry, I'm already at level 22 with an ether synchronization rate of 32%. I've long grasped willpower impacts and am very familiar with them. It won't affect you." Angelina smiled, as if she really thought that Titan was giving her guidance out of goodwill. She said to Rhoda, "Then let me guide you. It'll be beneficial for you to attain heaven's perception when you sense the information currents gushing into your brain." Feng Xingjian glanced at Titan and said, "Then come, what do I need to do?" Titan smiled and said, "No need, no need. Just relax." However, when he saw Feng Xingjian's tightly closed eyes, he suddenly remembered something. Is this guy blind? Is it Feng Xingjian? Titan was not a martial arts maniac like Hops. Naturally, he had also heard of this year's regional champion, Feng Xingjian. However, when he realized this, the jealousy and hatred in his heart seemed to rise even higher. Especially looking at the other party's face, height, and talent, it would be a lie to say that she wasn't jealous. So what if you're a genius? Your synchronization rate is definitely not as high as mine right now. I'll attack you with a one-sided willpower attack and embarrass you. As he thought of this, he activated his heaven's perception and started to use his martial will to attack the other party. Willpower attack was to use one's memories and martial will to attack the other party, attacking and defending at the consciousness level. This was a skill that could only be used when one's ether synchronization rate had reached 30%. It was because only conferred knights with ether synchronization rate above 30% would be able to leave behind information in physical matter. After Titan activated his heaven's perception, his consciousness surged toward Feng Xingjian's body. He had already prepared a bunch of things in his mind, especially his own martial will. He wanted to give Fang Xingjian a good shock and embarrass him. It would be best if Fang Xingjian fainted from shock. Thinking of this, the corners of Titan's lips curled up uncontrollably. One should not assume that conferred knights were carefree and noble. It was just that they were stronger than ordinary people. It might be because of their mental cultivation methods that some of them did not like to fight. However, it was possible that after becoming stronger, more conferred knights would have stronger desires. Moreover, after becoming conferred knights, they would have to fight for more resources and cultivation resources. Therefore, it might be easier for them to get into fights than when they were knights. There were not many conferred knights like Titan who would bully people who were of a lower level than them just because of some jealousy or fury. However, there were definitely quite a number of such conferred knights. However, when Titan came into contact with Fang Xingjian's body, he suddenly felt that something was wrong. It was because he realized that he was not the only one who was transmitting information over. Fang Xingjian seemed to be transmitting information over as well. He felt his vision darken, and it was as if a myriad of sand had come sweeping toward him. The surrounding air seemed to have become distorted and scorching hot. Titan felt as if he had entered a big steamer basket. What's going on? What on earth is going on? To think that such a tremendous amount of information has drowned out my senses, causing me to really think that my body and the environment have changed. How on earth did he do it? How could Fang Xingjian possibly do this? Just as he was thinking about this, a berserk voice rang out in Titan's mind. It's me, Damarov, who is the Sand Country's national hero. Who is it that has disturbed my long slumber? However, Titan had not expected that Fang Xingjian's entire skin would be encompassed by the level 29 superior divine armor, the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. He had wanted to use his heaven's perception to transmit information over, but when he came into contact with this superior divine armor, he had triggered the level 29 expert Damarov's retaliation. In the eyes of others, Titan had initially appeared to be very confident, looking at Fang Xingjian with a gaze filled with politeness. He was like a senior who wanted to guide his junior. However, all of a sudden his countenance turned ghastly pale and his body trembled incessantly. He leaped out as if he had seen a ghost, then fell onto the ground, trembling incessantly, drenched in sweat. What on earth is going on? Titan, what's wrong? Wasn't he the one who attacked Fang Xingjian with a willpower impact? Why does he look as if he has seen a ghost? Titan pointed at Fang Xingjian, but his mind was in a mess. Although he had cut off the connection in time, Damarov's destructive prowess was far too great, causing him to be unable to say a single word for a very long time. Angelina also walked over, squatted down, and looked at Titan with concern, saying, "Student Titan, how are you? Are you all right?" Fang Xingjian was stunned for a moment. Then he suddenly put out his hand. The skin on his hand changed slightly, as if a layer of it had been torn off. "I'm sorry. I forgot that I'm wearing the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. You must have been retaliated by the martial will on it, right?" Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, Titan finally understood what was going on. He felt as if a gush of blood was about to spurt out from his heart. Level 29 Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. You put this on and let me attack you? Aren't you bullying me? Chapter 276. If most people were to know what Titan was thinking, they would only sigh. That was indeed the case. The surrounding students looked at Titan, who had fallen to the ground, and their faces were filled with pity. It was too tragic to be attacked by the remnant martial will of a level 29 expert. The corners of Rhoda's lips twitched, and she smiled inwardly. Fang Xingjian also understood. The so-called information current attack should be similar to the impact he had received from Damarov's will. He secretly decided that in the future, he would spend some time to stimulate the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor every day, training his ability to withstand impacts. Angelina, who was in a daze, seemed to have only reacted at this moment. She tossed Titan aside and looked at Fang Xingjian in astonishment, saying, "You're Fang Xingjian?" The surrounding students also looked over. A few of them had recognized him previously, and now, Their gazes were filled with envy as they looked at Feng Xingjian. There was no other way about it. The level 29 Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor was too enviable. Just the impact of the information current alone would require one to have a level 28 or even level 29 ether synchronization rate. One could forget about using one's will to suppress Feng Xingjian. Feng Xingjian nodded at Angelina and said, "That's me." Angelina immediately walked up and walked one round around Feng Xingjian as if she was looking at a precious animal. She mumbled, "You're that Feng Xingjian who solved all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries and defeated the divine-level disciple, Holt?" Feng Xingjian nodded, and Angelina immediately grabbed Feng Xingjian's palm, unable to help but stroke it. "You're wearing the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor now, right? It feels so comfortable to the touch." She used her nose to sniff Feng Xingjian's palm, and there seemed to be little stars shining in her eyes. To Angelina, the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor was too attractive. She had applied to the Royal Armory countless times, but she had not been able to get this level 29 armor. It was because what she was most interested in was forging divine weapons. She was extremely familiar with all sorts of powerful divine weapons, especially those level 29 superior divine weapons and level 30 divine remains equipment. Angelina's face was flushed with excitement, and her hands kept on touching Feng Xingjian's body. She revealed an infatuated expression and said, "The Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. This was worn by His Majesty during the war between the Empire and the Sand Country 12 years ago. He killed the Sand Country's top general and national hero, Damarov. After that, it was handed over to the chief masters of the armory. They extracted his blood essence, bone marrow, and other essences from his body, and fused it with more than 4,000 types of rare natural treasures. It took them 10 years to forge it." She looked at Feng Xingjian's skin, almost drooling. "This texture is perfect. This toughness was perfect. This kind of luster and color is actually almost the same as the skin of a real person. Perfect, really too perfect." Rhoda pushed Angelina's hand away coldly and said, "Teacher, please pay attention to your etiquette." "Ah, yes. Angelina wiped the corner of her mouth, feeling a little embarrassed. She then looked at Feng Xingjian with bright eyes and said, "Well, Xingjian, do you want to join my divine weapon research team? We have the best masters in the entire Great Western region, and they forge the best divine weapons in the entire Great Western region." Hearing that, Rhoda's originally cold expression changed. Her eyes lit up as she said, "Is it the Divine Weapon Research Team, led by Governor Devitt?" "Huh? How did you know?" Angelina looked at Rhoda and asked, puzzled. Rhoda smiled, raised her brows, and said, "Lord Devitt himself is the #1 divine weapon forging master in the Great Western region. Naturally, the Academy's Divine Weapon Research Team is led by him." With that, she stared at Feng Xingjian, as if urging Feng Xingjian to agree quickly. Joining the Divine Weapon Research Team would not only allow him to get closer to Governor Devitt, but he would also be able to train his skills in forging divine weapons. Moreover, the governor's research team would not be short of money. Within a year or two, he would probably be able to get his hands on a few sets of divine weapon equipment. That's right. Lord Devitt is in there too. He's very good." Angelina looked at Feng Xingjian in anticipation and said, "If you go in, you'll definitely be able to be researched by us." "Oh, that's not right. We'll be researching divine weapons together." Many students, including Titan, looked at Feng Xingjian with envy, jealousy, and hatred. Regardless of whether it was the slender, capable, valiant, or the mature female teacher Angelina, who had an adorable face and a voluptuous figure, both of them were rare beauties. Moreover, one of them was a veteran conferred knight, while the other was about to become a conferred knight. Seeing how Feng Xingjian was surrounded by 2 beauties, how could the students not be envious? This was especially the case for Feng Xingjian, who was in the middle. He was tall and handsome, and was a genius amongst geniuses. Furthermore, he was wearing a level 29 divine weapon armor. He was definitely a winner in life. It should be said that everyone present was a winner in life as a conferred knight. However, When Fong Xingjian appeared, they experienced how their companions had felt when they looked at them in the past. This guy was a winner among winners. However, faced with Angelina's invitation, it was impossible for Fong Xingjian to agree. Time was tight for him, and he felt that it was not enough for him to pursue becoming stronger. How could he possibly waste his time on researching the forging of divine weapons? Moreover, he already had the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. He did not believe that after joining this research team, he would be able to get equipment that was better than the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. Therefore, Fong Xingjian shook his head and said, "No, I don't have the time to join. I'm sorry." Angelina frowned and looked at Fong Xingjian with watery eyes, as if she was a young lady who had been bullied. "Is it really impossible for me to join? Do you want to reconsider it?" She grabbed Fong Xingjian's palm and kept on caressing it, as if she was looking at her favorite toy. "After you join us, I'll definitely teach you well. Divine weapons are really interesting." The many male students at the side seemed to hear the sound of shattering glass in their hearts. Titan was so infuriated that he trembled once again, feeling that his consciousness had become even more chaotic. Rhoda coughed and gently separated their palms once again. At the same time, she glared fiercely at Fong Xingjian. Fong Xingjian rubbed his brows, feeling a little baffled. However, he still insisted and said, "I'm sorry, I really don't have the time to join the research team." "Oh, right, I still have something on. I'll take my leave first." With that, he took a few steps forward, bringing along a few streams of sword cheese as he headed in the direction of the Killing Techniques Palace. After listening to the lecture and understanding the consciousness impact of conferred knights, he had gained something. He planned on going to the Killing Techniques Palace according to his original plan. Rhoda let out a cold snort and chased after him. Chapter 277. Hello. May I know how to get to the Sword Arts Department's Killing Techniques Palace? A young maid pointed the way for Fong Xingjian with a red face. After saying that, she left in a fluster. Rhoda walked up behind Fong Xingjian and revealed a mysterious smile, saying, "You've been quite popular with girls recently. Is that so?" Fong Xingjian turned to look at her and said, "What's the matter? You want to go to the Killing Techniques Palace? Learning killing techniques? But the killing techniques in the Killing Techniques Palace." Suddenly, Rhoda reacted and looked at Fong Xingjian in astonishment. "You've completed the second transition?" Seeing that Fong Xingjian had nodded, her big eyes were filled with curiosity. She immediately asked, "What's your second transition job?" However, she immediately reacted and added, "If it's not convenient for you, you don't have to tell me." Fong Xingjian did not feel that it was inconvenient. Right now, there were many things that he did not need to be secretive about. In fact, he could even intimidate his enemies or attract investments if he revealed it. Therefore, he said, "The Heavenly Sword Sovereign has a growth of +10 in all 5 attributes." As for his specialties, that was a private matter. Fong Xingjian did not plan on revealing it. The Heavenly Sword Sovereign? Why haven't I heard of it before? Hearing that all 5 attributes had a growth of +10, Rhoda immediately said in astonishment, "An average of 10 attribute points for each level? Isn't that too high? I know that the highest second transition jobs only have an average of 8 or 9 attribute points at each level." She nodded. "It's no wonder that you want to go to the Killing Techniques Palace. Now that you've completed the second transition, you can learn the killing techniques of conferred knights." Fong Xingjian sensed that she was still following them and asked, "You're going as well?" Rhoda's brows twitched, as if she was exuding a heroic aura. "Why? Do you have a problem with that?" Fong Xingjian shrugged. Of course, he did not mind. Therefore, although the two of them seemed to be strolling leisurely, they were actually moving at subsonic speed. They arrived at the entrance of courtyard. The courtyard's gate was over 5 meters tall, and behind it were layers of buildings and walls. This was the Sword Arts Department's Killing Techniques Palace. The entire Killing Techniques Palace was filled with pavilions, terraces, and buildings with layers upon layers. It looked just like the royal palace. Rhoda seemed to be stunned by the imposing aura of the Killing Techniques Palace as well. She exhaled and said, "The students from the regional academy are really rich." Just this killing techniques palace alone is comparable to the entire Cursed Academy. Feng Xingjian said casually, one of them is a knight from a region, while the other is a conferred knight from a great region. They're directly under the command of the #1 character in the Great Western region. Naturally, there's a world of difference between them. As the two of them spoke, they had already stepped through the door and entered the first level of the Killing Techniques Palace. Even before entering, Zhang Xian could already see a huge golden sword standing in the center of the hall. The golden sword was about 10 meters tall, pierced into the ground. It looked as if it was going to slice the entire ground in half, and it exuded a desolate, killing intent. Below the huge sword, a handsome middle-aged man with 2 small tufts of mustache sat there, studying a book in detail. In front of him, 2 knights held swords in their hands and were practicing a set of swordsmanship. Their swords flashed, and their moves were practiced. The most terrifying thing was that as the swords in their hands danced, rays of golden light gathered around the swords, and from time to time, lightning would shoot out. It was clear that this sword technique was one that could control thunderbolts to attack the enemy. The handsome middle-aged man seemed to have sensed that someone had entered. He threw a glance at Feng Xingjian and said, "There's a total of 4 levels in the Killing Techniques Palace. After cultivating each level and defeating the teacher on duty, you'll be able to proceed to the next level." With that, he pointed to the huge sword behind him and said, "The Thunderbolt sword technique of the first level is recorded on it. Take a look for yourselves." Hearing his words, Rhoda frowned and asked softly, puzzled, "Why do we have to defeat the teacher before we can proceed to the next level? Why can't we learn whichever level we want?" Although her voice was soft, everyone present was a second transition conferred knight. How could they not have heard what she had said? A man who was practicing the Thunderbolt sword technique could not help but stop. He threw a sideways glance at the two of them and said in a somewhat condescending tone, "You guys must be newbies, right? Is the Killing Techniques Palace a place where you can discuss as you wish?" These were 4 sets of sword techniques that the masters of the Sword Arts Department had carefully selected from thousands upon thousands of sets of sword techniques over many years. These 4 sets of killing techniques were arranged from easy to difficult. After learning the first set, one would then learn the second set. After learning the second set, one would be able to synthesize it. After learning the third set, one would then synthesize it again. With each additional set of sword techniques learned and synthesized, the prowess of the sword technique would increase by several times. After synthesizing all 4 sets of sword techniques, one would be able to cultivate the ultimate profoundness of the Killing Techniques Palace, the prodigious demolition sword. Don't make wild guesses about things you don't know. The Great Western Region Regional Academy has been established and modified by many generations of predecessors. Every inch and every step has a deep meaning. In the future, it's best for you to ask fewer questions and do more things. This is the way of cultivation. With that, he no longer looked at Feng Xingjian and Rhoda, focusing on his own cultivation of the Thunderbolt sword technique. Rhoda's countenance was a little grim. However, the other party was stronger than her, and his words were more logical than hers. Thus, she could not rebut him. She could only let out a cold snort and focus her gaze on that huge golden sword. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she could see that there were many densely packed runes engraved on the huge sword. All of them were the detailed cultivation methods for the Thunderbolt sword technique, as well as many diagrams and human figures. Feng Xingjian had also walked up to take a look at the Thunderbolt sword technique. With just one look, he realized that this Thunderbolt sword technique was indeed much more complicated than the first transition killing techniques. Not only did it involve the circulation of one's vital energy and blood, but each and every move required the user to exchange energy with the ether particles in the outside world to obtain the power of thunderbolts. There were also sword techniques that stimulated thunderbolts in the first transition, but that was using one's physical strength in exchange for the power of thunderbolts. However, this Thunderbolt sword technique used one's physical strength to activate 10 parts of Thunderbolt's powers. It was a sword technique that truly borrowed the tremendous powers of the heavens and the earth. Looking at the introduction, this Thunderbolt sword technique started from activating thunderbolts and summoning lightning all the way to the 10th level, the realm of vigorous thunderbolt. It started from an ordinary electric baton to the final stage, which had the effect of a lightning storm, producing astonishing destructive prowess. With each sword and move, the user would be able to absorb the power of the ether particles in the air, forming lightning and sending down a myriad of thunderbolts. They would be able to melt steel at a high temperature of over 10,000 degrees Celsius, and the resulting explosion would be able to destroy half a street. This Thunderbolt sword technique is really very powerful. Fang Xingjian nodded. Although this Thunderbolt sword technique was very powerful and complicated, Fang Xingjian's current cultivation level was at his 4 specialties: Genius Sword Arts, Grandmaster Sword Arts, Level 1 Unparalleled Sword Intent, and Darkness Sword Sense, had already allowed his senses towards sword arts and ether particles to increase by several folds. Moreover, he already had the world's best sword arts talent. As the first level of the Killing Techniques Palace, this Thunderbolt sword technique was the simplest of the 4 sword techniques. It was much simpler than the 90,000 godly demon flash of 8 techniques of the West. After spending only 5 minutes to look through this Thunderbolt sword technique, Fang Xingjian had already understood the gist of it. His stats window also had an additional skill, Thunderbolt sword technique, level 1. Chapter 278. The mentors in the Killing Techniques Palace naturally took turns to be on duty. After all, as conferred knights, they had too many things to do. Therefore, they could only take turns to provide guidance on sword arts. Usually, there would be 4.5 hours in the morning and 4.5 hours in the afternoon. For the rest of the time, there would be no mentors around. Most of the time, it was not the academy's teachers, but just the students. However, there was no need to doubt their sword arts cultivation. They were people who had trained the sword technique they were in charge of to the maximum level and had even reached the later few stages. They had either completed it or were working hard to synthesize it. Of course, after synthesizing it, the essence of the Thunderbolt sword technique would still be present, and they would still be able to perform it. Duolin, who was in charge of the Thunderbolt sword technique, was one of the students. He was ranked 38th in the academy and had reached the maximum level of the Thunderbolt sword technique at level 15. The first stage of the Killing Techniques Palace was not likely to send someone too strong to guard it. After all, if the top 3 conferred knights were to be sent to guard it, it would be a waste of the experts' time, and the disciples who were here to learn the Thunderbolt sword technique would not be able to pass the stage and learn the later stages. Even so, Duolin, who had reached level 15 in the Thunderbolt sword technique, would still have to put in a lot of effort to defeat him. Based on Duolin's judgment, the 2 people who had been cultivating the Thunderbolt sword technique at the first level of the Killing Techniques Palace for the past few months would need at least another year to be able to defeat him and pass the first stage to the next stage. As for newcomers like Fang Xingjian, Duolin felt that it would probably take even longer, especially since the learning at the beginning would be a waste of his time. Therefore, after seeing how Fang Xingjian was reading through the Thunderbolt sword technique, Duolin let out a sigh of helplessness and put down the manual regarding the mountain shifting sword. This was the sword technique manual for the next stage, and it was also the one he would read every time he took charge of the first stage after copying it down. The reason why he put down the manual was because he knew that Fang Xingjian would definitely ask him questions as he read through the manual, asking for guidance. Therefore, he decided not to read it. However, under his astonished gaze, Fang Xingjian, who had only scanned through the Thunderbolt sword technique once, did not ask him for guidance at all. Fang Xingjian merely focused on practicing with his sword. The Netherworld River had been damaged during the regional selection, so Fang Xingjian could only temporarily use the level 9 divine weapon, Demon's Howl, which he had bought in Cursed Black Market. However, with the Heavenly Sword Sovereign's specialty, Swordless Path, even the level 9 Demon's Howl had been strengthened into a level 19 inferior divine weapon. It shone brightly like an effulgence weapon. However, although he had the Swordless Path, One of the reasons why Feng Xingjian wanted to earn money was to change his longsword or even purchase a tremendous amount of rare treasures to strengthen himself, just like what he had done in Cursed. It would be even better if he could buy a level 29 superior divine weapon. Hey, the Thunderbolt sword technique is not an ordinary killing technique. It draws out the energy from the ether particles in the air to form lightning attacks. If you don't use it well, you'll hurt yourself. For someone like you to just take a look and practice it yourself, Duoluan stopped halfway through his words. It was because Feng Xingjian, who was dancing around Demonis Howl, was still a little shaky at the start. However, after a few moves, he became very familiar with it. Halfway through his words, streams of electricity appeared in the surrounding air. As Feng Xingjian's Demonis Howl pierced through the air, they turned into streams of electricity snakes that slithered around Feng Xingjian. What kind of joke is this? He's already mastered the first level of the Thunderbolt sword technique. The two students at the side also looked at Feng Xingjian in astonishment, as if they could not believe what he had just done. Rhoda smiled proudly. She did not know why, but when she saw how astonished the three of them were, she felt a sense of satisfaction and pride surging in her heart. She could not help but say, "Haven't you guys heard of this year's regional champion, Feng Xingjian? He's the one who solved all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries. How could the Thunderbolt sword technique be a problem for him?" Hearing Rhoda's words, Duoluan also reacted. "That's right, this guy keeps squinting his eyes. I thought that it was because his eyes were small, but it turns out that he's blind." It said that Feng Xingjian is blind. Just as the few of them were feeling astonished, the long sword in Feng Xingjian's hand moved to and fro like lightning in the sky, piercing through the air and letting out thunderous sounds. As he continued to brandish his long sword, the electricity that was shot out increased in number and intensity. In the blink of an eye, it was like a huge ball of lightning, surrounding Feng Xingjian completely. This level of lightning, it's already at level 2? No, it's already at level 3 or 4. Right now, Duoluan could no longer maintain his composure. He stood up in great astonishment, looking at Feng Xingjian as if he was looking at a god. Indeed, to be able to cultivate sword arts at such a fast speed as Feng Xingjian's, he would be like a god in the eyes of ordinary people. Feng Xingjian did not have any intention to hide it either. His sword stance changed once again, and streams of sword cheese and thunderous sounds rang out consecutively. The densely packed lightning gradually condensed and gathered, turning into many plasma-like lightning dragons that gathered around Feng Xingjian's sword. They continued to move about together with Feng Xingjian's sword dance. Feng Xingjian's Thunderbolt sword technique continued to improve at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye. He extracted the power of the ether particles in the air, and a continuously increasing number of electrons jumped and danced around him like spirits. They were as obedient as puppies. The students present, who had been learning the Thunderbolt sword technique, no longer had the arrogance they had before. They even felt a hint of embarrassment when they thought of how they had behaved earlier. It was as if they were ashamed of showing off in front of Guan Yu. However, they were unwilling to leave or lower their heads. It was because they were afraid that they would miss out on Feng Xingjian's sword dance. They watched as Feng Xingjian performed the Thunderbolt sword technique move after move, his long sword drawing out many graceful trajectories. The vital energy, blood, tendons, and bones in his body continued to circulate, changing the frequency of his body. The ether particles in and out of his body continued to exchange intensely, producing violent energy flows. There were many sword theories that they did not understand in the past, but after watching Feng Xingjian's sword dance, they seemed to have gained a new understanding. They looked at Feng Xingjian's sword dance hungrily, as if they were looking at a teacher's guidance. This was especially so for Feng Xingjian's incessant corrections and improvement in his movements. It was something that they could only dream of. 10 minutes, 30 minutes. An hour passed by. Everyone present watched quietly as Feng Xingjian danced the Demonis Howl. The surrounding electrons seemed to be getting increasingly denser, and everyone's bodies felt a faint feeling of numbness. The few electric dragons that flowed along the body of Fang Xingjian's sword were so bright that they turned white. It was as if there were several hundred incandescent lamps stacked together, causing others to be unable to see his figure clearly. Finally, as Fang Xingjian retracted his sword force, a myriad of thunderous sword howls rang out, and all the electric dragons gathered together, turning into a heaven-piercing lightning pillar. With a light tap from the tip of Fang Xingjian's sword, it struck down onto the ground of the hall. Chapter 279. As the sound of thunder reverberated, Rhoda was the first to be unable to take it. Her face turned pale, and she covered her ears. The remaining 3 conferred knights did not have it easy either. With a stifled grunt, they retreated. The violent thunderbolt pierced through the air, and the air currents flowed in all directions like boiling water, bringing with them a burning smell. Everyone felt their bodies turn numb. The repercussions of the thunderbolt had left behind electrons in the air, causing them to be paralyzed and unable to move. Everyone felt as if they were being enveloped by an endless explosive high temperature, and they could only activate their reduced force fields to fend it off. This continued until a piercing light flashed past, and it was as if a huge dragon formed from thunderbolts had devoured the earth and drilled into it. When the light gradually dissipated, only a huge hole of over 5 meters deep was left in ground. At the bottom of the hole was a large amount of glass-like crystals, as if lava had flowed past the surface. Countless thunderbolts formed a high temperature of several 10,000 degrees Celsius, melting the ground. To think that such a terrifying destructive force could be produced just by channeling the thunderbolt powers into the ground. Duoluan looked at Fang Xingjian with a complicated expression and mumbled, "Level 10? His Thunderbolt sword technique has reached level 10? Haha, to be able to cultivate the Thunderbolt sword technique to level 10 in just over an hour. Have all our previous cultivation gone to waste?" As for the other 2 students, they were already in a daze. They had never seen someone who could cultivate the Thunderbolt sword technique to level 10 in just 1 hour. Rhoda looked at this scene with a proud and hopeful gaze, as if she was the one who had done it. However, Duoluan could not care less and asked directly, "You've cultivated the Thunderbolt sword technique to level 10? His gaze was solemn, and he was extremely serious. Fang Xingjian nodded and said with some dissatisfaction, "It's level 10. If I continue to cultivate it, the efficiency will be slower. I'm afraid that I won't be able to reach the maximum level in one go." Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, Duoluan felt extremely disheartened. Fang Xingjian had cultivated the Thunderbolt sword technique to level 10 within an hour, yet he was still not satisfied. Then what about people like them who had been staying in the Killing Techniques Palace for a long period of time? He could only say sourly, "More haste, less speed. You're progressing too fast. You might not have mastered many of the basics. Maybe you'll reach max level slowly." Hearing this, the other 2 students nodded in agreement. However, Rhoda was displeased and retorted, "No matter how fast he is, he's still faster than other people who practice the Thunderbolt sword technique." Hearing this, Doran was almost infuriated to death. However, seeing Rhoda's appearance, it was not good for him to quarrel with a beautiful young lady. Therefore, he could only look at Fang Xingjian with a vengeful gaze along with the other 2 students. Fang Xingjian didn't care about that. He flicked the banshee's howl with his finger and said to Duoluan, "Please enlighten me." Duoluan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You want to challenge me to the Thunderbolt sword technique?" He seemed to be in slight disbelief at what Fang Xingjian had said. However, Fang Xingjian nodded and said seriously, "Don't I have to defeat you before I can learn the later killing techniques?" "Haha, you're really confident in defeating me." There was an additional hint of mockery in Duoluan's expression. "What level are you at now? What's your synchronization rate?" Rhoda also walked up and tried to persuade him. "Xingjian, what's the hurry? You've only learned it for an hour today. You'd better consolidate your Thunderbolt sword technique and challenge him after you've reached the max level. How can cultivating sword arts in isolation be faster than sparring with experts who practice the same sword arts as you? It's fine if you can't find such an opportunity, but the Killing Techniques Palace has provided you with such an opportunity. How can you let go so easily? Fang Xingjian stroked the Banshee's howl that had been strengthened to level 19 by the swordless path and said calmly, "Please enlighten me." You're not wrong. Whether I've practiced my sword arts correctly or not, I'll know after sparring with an expert. Duoluan stood up and looked at Fang Xingjian arrogantly. He was ranked 38th this year and was at level 22. His Thunderbolt sword technique was at level 15. Even if Fang Xingjian's talent was stronger than his, it would be impossible for Fang Xingjian to defeat him without a few months of practice. Even after a few months, Fang Xingjian might not be able to defeat him. Duoluan drew out a purple long sword with electricity flowing around it. It was a level 19 superior divine weapon and had an extremely strong enhancement effect for the Thunderbolt sword technique. He held onto the long sword and pointed it at Fang Xingjian from the side. With the demeanor of an expert, he said to Fang Xingjian, "Make your move. I'll give you some pointers on your sword arts so that you can..." Before Duoluan could finish his words, a flash of sword light had already shone before him. He barely managed to block with his sword and block Fang Xingjian's attack. So fast, rumbling sounds of thunder rang out as their long swords clashed. At the same time, a myriad of electricity burst forth, and Duoluan retreated, drenched in cold sweat. However, Fang Xingjian's attacks had always been relentless. The Demon's howl in his hand brought about a series of afterimages, and the wind prints on it continued to slice through the scorching air, letting out piercing, whistling sounds. At the same time, with each sword attack from Fang Xingjian, there would be thunderbolts trembling in the void space, accompanied by streams of lightning, striking Duoluan's body. However, the Thunderbolt sword technique controlled thunderbolts, so how could he possibly be injured by them? Duoluan performed the lightning evasion stance, and countless thunderbolts were channeled into the ground through his body, not causing him any harm at all. However, Duoluan was infuriated after being forced in such a pathetic state by Fang Xingjian. He made up his mind to teach Fang Xingjian a lesson and teach this arrogant genius a lesson. Duoluan's Thunderbolt sword technique was fully displayed, and densely packed thunderbolts exploded in the void space, blasting toward Fang Xingjian in waves. Fang Xingjian received the attack with a lightning evasion stance as well. Then he swept his sword horizontally and retaliated with thunderbolts. The two of them exchanged blows, moving around the first level of the palace hall. Each time their swords clashed, there would be thunderous explosions and electrical sparks. White light flickered, continuously illuminating their bodies. They pierced through the air and emitted waves of high temperatures. Amidst the thunderbolts, streams of thunderbolts moved around their bodies like dragons and snakes. From time to time, they would strike the ground, creating black charred marks. Ordinary knights would probably lose all ability to resist when faced with such thunderbolt attacks. Rhoda and the others had long since retreated and arrived outside the door. They looked at the two figures moving about amidst the electrical sparks, sending out a myriad of thunderbolts and clashing against each other, causing explosions and high temperatures. The scene looked as if there were two thunderstorms fighting incessantly, fighting for territory. A student looked at this scene in astonishment. What's going on? Brother Duoluan. To think that Brother Duoluan can't take him down? It's not just that he can't take him down. Another student's eyes were wide open like light bulbs. This lad is starting to get the upper hand. Chapter 280. Putting aside the two students' astonishment, Duoluan, who was in the midst of battle, was even more astonished. It was because he realized that no matter how much more powerful his attacks were or how much he went all out, his attacks would be easily neutralized by Fang Xingjian. No matter how fast and ferocious his sword moves were, Fang Xingjian would always find their flaws. He would not even be able to unleash a single decent attack before his attacks would be neutralized by Fang Xingjian's attacks. He had no choice but to quickly retreat to defend. No matter how ferocious or how many thunderbolts there were, it was as if Fang Xingjian was taking a leisurely stroll, casually guiding the thunderbolts into the ground. Duoluin was almost unharmed. Of course, Duoluin did not know that Feng Xingjian was currently wearing the level 29 Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor. Even if the thunderbolts really struck him, he would be fine. Moreover, right now, Feng Xingjian's unparalleled sword intent, Apex combined with darkness sword sense, gave him a great advantage against a swordsman of the same level. In the image of heaven's perception constructed in his brain, Duoluin's entire body was covered in countless flickering starlight. The brighter the starlight, the greater the flaws. These starlights seemed to disappear in an instant. Sometimes, they would be extremely bright one moment before turning dim the next. However, this was enough for Feng Xingjian. It was because his sword arts were fast enough that he was able to easily neutralize the flaws in Duoluin's moves. After Duoluin attacked, he would only be able to unleash 30% of his powers before he would be forced to change his moves and clash head-on with Feng Xingjian, who was attacking at full power. Therefore, even though Duoluin's physical strength was clearly stronger than Feng Xingjian's, he was still forced to retreat. Unless he could completely ignore the sharpness of Feng Xingjian's longsword and unleash the ability to kill an experienced master with random punches, he would have no choice but to retreat time and time again when faced with Feng Xingjian's level 19 longsword, which was surrounded by layers of electric dragons. As for the thunderbolts that were summoned from void space, countless ripples appeared in Feng Xingjian's eyes. The energies that were converted from ether particles were like leaves falling onto a pond, creating ripples in the air. The center of each ripple was the weakest point of the lightning power. As long as Feng Xingjian followed the changes in the ripples, he would be able to easily move through the lightning. Unparalleled sword intent, Apex in addition to darkness sword sense. These two specialties, which allowed one to understand sword moves and ether particles, as well as at the same time break through sword moves and ether particles, were combined together. This was the first time Feng Xingjian had used them in battle, and they had produced an astonishing effect. They allowed Feng Xingjian to rapidly understand the changes in the human body sword movements, as well as the process of ether particles flowing and exchanging energy. He could also instantly find the flaws and weak points. Then, through the conversion of information through heaven's perception, they would clearly appear in the image constructed in his brain. The last thing he needed to do was to follow this feeling and judgment to easily break through his opponent's moves. The two of them fought faster and faster, performing the Thunderbolt sword technique at the same time. The entire hall seemed to have turned into a thunderstorm. Duoluin and Feng Xingjian, who were using the same set of sword techniques, were fighting with all their might to seize control over the lightning. At the start, Duoluin was able to control over 70% of the lightning and had an absolute advantage, causing Feng Xingjian to only be able to defend passively. However, as Feng Xingjian broke through Duoluin's moves time and time again, slowly breaking down the lightning around him, the ratio of control kept on changing. Duoluin's absolute advantage of 70% also became 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%. When the ratio of control over the lightning dropped rapidly like a waterfall, the sweat on Duoluin's forehead increased. When he only had 20% of control over the lightning, almost all the lightning in the hall was blasting toward Duoluin unceasingly. The ground trembled continuously, and many large pits were blasted by the lightning strikes. It was as if Duoluin was trapped in a cage of lightning, with countless bolts of lightning striking toward him one after another, almost causing him to be exhausted from running for his life. Finally, with a loud boom, he was no longer able to channel the power of the lightning into the ground. He was sent flying out from the explosion, smashing through the walls of the hall. Letting out a loud bellow, the reduced force field on Duoluin's body burst forth, sending all the rocks on his body flying. However, he still seemed to have turned into a refugee, covered in stone powder and dust from head to toe. He wanted to walk back to the hall, but he discovered that when he exerted a little force in his legs, an intense numbing sensation came over him. He could not move at all. He had been paralyzed by the electricity. To think that I've lost to someone who has just picked up the Thunderbolt sword technique? A strong sense of shame welled up in Dwelluin's head. Just then, the sound of shattering stone rang out again. Dwelluin lifted his head and saw Fong Xingjian slowly walking out from the hole he had created. He saw the myriad of electric snakes surrounding Fong Xingjian, piercing through the air and slithering around as if they were alive. Then, when the electric snakes heated up the air, releasing crackling sounds, his pupils contracted completely. Any one of these electric snakes had the prowess of a howitzer. Looking at the myriad of electric snakes slithering around him, Dwelluin felt his hair stand up. He suppressed his voice and said, "Your Thunderbolt sword technique has reached level 12. This was an effect he could only achieve at level 12. Moreover, the electric snakes he could create were not as many as Fong Xingjian's, who was more agile. Fong Xingjian nodded. "It's all thanks to your help. As expected, if I want to improve my sword arts, sparring with experts is the most effective way." Still going? Looking at Fong Xingjian's calm expression, Dwelluin suddenly felt a chill in his heart. What was there to continue? Fong Xingjian's level 10 Thunderbolt sword technique was already enough to kill him, let alone now that he was at level 12. When he saw that the other two students had followed him out as well, this feeling became even more intense. Feelings of shame kept on surging up, and Dwelluin did not say a single word and just left at lightning speed. There was only one thought that kept on surging up in his mind. Fong Xingjian had been able to defeat his years of hard work with just 1 hour of learning. With a conferred knight like this in the field of sword arts, was there really a need for him to continue learning sword arts? At this moment, Dwelluin even had the thought of giving up on sword arts and switching to something else. What he did not know was that as Fong Xingjian continued to grow, more and more people would have their confidence in learning sword arts crushed like him. Looking at the departing Dwelluin, Fong Xingjian tilted his neck and said, "This should be considered my win, right?" The other two students looked at each other, unable to say a word. Rhoda chuckled and said, "You've even chased the teacher in charge of this stage away. Of course you passed." Fong Xingjian shook his head and said, "Then let's go to the next stage." Rhoda chuckled as she followed behind Fong Xingjian. This man, with outstanding talent, seemed to be able to bring her different surprises each time they met. He was like a treasure trove that kept on multiplying, and each time it was opened, there would be endless mysteries and halos. One of the students immediately shouted, "You haven't passed the stage. You can't go in." Rhoda's brows twitched, turned around, and said, "I'm not a sword practitioner. Even if I go in, I won't be learning your killing techniques. Moreover, don't you guys want to see which stage Fong Xingjian will be able to reach today?" The two students were stunned for a moment. After Fong Xingjian and Rhoda had walked far away, obvious hesitation appeared on their faces. "There doesn't seem to be any meaning for us to stay here, right? Even Brother Dwelluin has left. What's the difference between training here and training in other places? Let's go take a look. Let's go take a look. At the same time, we can remind our seniors in the next stage that this guy is too strange." Chapter 281. Rhoda followed Fong Xingjian into the second palace in the Killing Techniques Palace. This place was many times bigger than the palace in the first stage. Or rather, it could no longer be called a palace. A winding canyon that was over 200 meters deep, several hundred meters long, over 100 meters wide, and over 10 meters narrow appeared before Fong Xingjian and Rhoda. To think that this was a canyon built in the Killing Techniques Palace? The entire canyon looked as if someone had descended from the skies and slashed it open with a sword. The bottom of the canyon was filled with densely packed plants, and there were even animals resting in them. To think that a huge canyon was surrounded by many pavilions and terraces. What a majestic sight it was. Even though Fong Xingjian was used to seeing great buildings on Earth, he could not help but be slightly astonished at this scene. Rhoda was extremely astonished. She looked at the stone staircase that led deep into the canyon and said, "The second palace is in this canyon? Or could it be that the entire canyon is the second palace? Did this canyon exist from the start? Or was it created by someone?" After witnessing the maze that the melancholic monarch had created, she was no longer sure if this canyon had been formed naturally. Feng Xingjian shook his head. He could only see the surrounding 10 meters with his heaven's perception, but he was unable to see the entire canyon. Rhoda turned her head, looked at Feng Xingjian's face, and suddenly said, Your eyes. Right now, Feng Xingjian's eyes were open. Other than his pupils being even deeper and darker, there was no difference between him and an ordinary person. He looked just like an ordinary person. Feng Xingjian said calmly, In the sparring earlier, my Thunderbolt sword technique leveled up, allowing my comprehension of ether particles to increase once again. My ether synchronization rate has reached 15%, and I can now convert visual information. I feel that I'm more used to opening my eyes. This meant that right now, Feng Xingjian felt like an ordinary person opening their eyes. It was just that he did not receive information from his eyes, but from his heaven's perception. Moreover, it was only within a 10-meter radius around him. Rhoda nodded. In her heart, she was still digesting the news that Feng Xingjian's synchronization rate had reached 15%. This speed of improvement was truly shocking. Right now, she had yet to attain heaven's perception, while Feng Xingjian had continuously completed his job transitions and even attained breakthroughs, raising his synchronization rate to 15%. This speed was too fast. Subconsciously, Rhoda fell behind Feng Xingjian. Looking at Feng Xingjian's back, she suddenly felt disheartened. Can I really catch up to him? However, this feeling only lasted for a short while. Rhoda puffed out her chest, her eyes filled with determination. She looked at Feng Xingjian with eyes full of fighting spirit. Why not? If Feng Xingjian could do it, why can't I? Even if I can't do everything, the higher his improvement, the more difficulties he'll encounter. His speed will definitely slow down. As long as I give it my all, I'll definitely have a chance to catch up to him. Young people, especially those who had become conferred knights, would all have the confidence to change the world. At this point in time, almost all of them would think that they were the best. Although Rhoda had seen how powerful Feng Xingjian was, she did not lose her fighting spirit because of this setback. Instead, she made up her mind that she would definitely work hard and catch up to him. I'll increase my training when I go back today. Before the end of this month, I must attain heaven's perception. Naturally, Feng Xingjian could not sense Rhoda's thoughts. He walked along the canyon, and the deeper he went, the steeper the surrounding cliffs became. The stone staircase they were walking on seemed to be carved into the walls of the cliffs, and a few inches below their feet was a deep canyon suspended in the air. It was as if they would fall down with just a single wrong step. The canyon was extremely winding, and the stone staircase kept on winding up and down, allowing them to walk a little further. However, the two of them were conferred knights and knights respectively, and their physical attributes far surpassed that of ordinary people. To ordinary people, this would be a hopeless situation, but to them, it was just a slightly unique scenery. After walking for a few hundred meters and going through countless twists and turns, a huge platform appeared before the two of them. The entire platform protruded out from the cliffs. Or rather, it could not be said to be a platform. It was because the platform was in the shape of a longsword. It was as if a huge sword had pierced out from the cliffs. This was a cliff that was over 100 meters deep from the bottom of the canyon. There were many shadows under their feet, and it was almost impossible to see what was inside clearly. To be able to build such a giant sword platform in the middle of the cliff, it could be said to be the work of the gods. Rhoda's eyes were once again filled with astonishment. There was no need for sword arts, powers, or battles. Just this platform in the Killing Techniques Palace was enough to display the unfathomable power of the regional academy. Right now, there was only Fatso lying on the platform, snoring thunderously. He was sleeping. However, there was a row of words carved in front of him. The secret manual is carved on the platform. Don't disturb my sleep. If you want to challenge someone, wait for another teacher. Rhoda looked at Fatso, who was sleeping on the platform, and could not help but smile. I thought that conferred knights are all cultivating with all their might, wishing that they could split every second into two. To think that there are conferred knights who slack off. Fang Xingjian frowned and said, maybe it's some martial technique that they cultivate in their sleep? He shook his head. He was not sure about this, but this did not stop him from learning the sword technique carved on ground. This was a sword technique known as the mountain shifting sword. This was a powerful sword technique that could control the geomagnetism, change the direction of the Earth's veins, and make use of the power of the land's tectonic plates to uproot mountains and seas, change the terrain, and even form earthquakes and tsunamis. Just as Fang Xingjian was reading the mountain shifting sword, the two students from the first stage had already rushed over. They ran up to Fatso and said, Brother Ronin, wake up! Brother Duoluin has been defeated. They repeated this many times before Fatso, who was like a mountain of flesh, opened his eyes impatiently. A fierce gleam flashed through his small eyes as he scolded fiercely. So what if he's defeated? With his lousy sword arts, there's nothing strange about him losing. But the other party only learned it for an hour. After learning it for an hour, he reached level 10 of the Thunderbolt sword technique and defeated Brother Duoluin. Fatso, who had been addressed as Ronin, laughed out loud, his eyes filled with disdain and mockery. What nonsense are you spouting? Reaching level 10 of the Thunderbolt sword technique in an hour. Do you think that learning sword arts is as easy as eating and drinking? How could Ronin possibly believe such a thing? He had never even heard of someone who could reach level 10 of the Thunderbolt sword technique in 10 hours, let alone someone who could reach level 10 of the Thunderbolt sword technique in an hour. It was impossible for him to believe such a thing. It was true. Any rational knight or conferred knight in Miracle World would not believe it if they had not witnessed this scene for themselves. It was because such a thing had never happened in their history. However, he still woke up eventually. Therefore, he threw a sideways glance at Fang Xingjian and asked, You're the one who defeated Duoluin? He took a few looks at Fang Xingjian and thought to himself, to think that Duoluin was unable to fend off such a young lad? This guy is really regressing. Chapter 282. Seeing that Ronin still did not believe him, the two students became even more anxious and shouted, He's Fang Xingjian, this year's regional champion, a genius who has comprehended all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's profoundness. He really managed to bring the Thunderbolt sword technique to level 10 within an hour. Seeing the serious expressions on their faces, Ronin's brows furrowed. He still found it hard to believe such a thing. It was too unbelievable. This was like someone telling a high school teacher that someone had finished all the papers in 10 minutes for the college entrance examination and had even gotten full marks. Who would believe it? Ronin, who was like a mountain of flesh, shook his head and said, even if it's 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's knowledge, to be able to bring the Thunderbolt sword technique to level 10 within an hour? Even divine level experts have never done something like this. Have you heard of the Pantheon Monument left behind by the melancholic monarch 200 years ago, that he was able to bring a killing technique to level 10 within an hour? The two students were left speechless, unable to reply. That's right. Fang Xingjian was able to do something that even divine level experts had not been able to do. The two students immediately became extremely suspicious. Looking at the two of them who were hesitating, Luo Nan smiled and revealed a pleased expression. He said, that's why it's impossible to cultivate the Thunderbolt sword technique to level 10 within an hour. According to my estimation, as he spoke, he stroked his double chin and said, this guy should have cultivated the Thunderbolt sword technique beforehand and cultivated it all the way to level 10. Then he came here to pretend that he had just started cultivating it. It's not just level 10. From what Brother Duoluin said, he's already at level 12. And what's the point of him doing this? Point. Fatso Ronin sneered. He thought that he had figured out the reason, and his tone became even more confident. What else could there be? To pretend to be a genius? Since young, have you guys not seen many geniuses who don't work hard during the day, but secretly work hard at night? He's just another guy who likes to put on an act. As Ronin said that, he looked in the direction of Fang Xingjian and Rhoda and intentionally said loudly, remember this. The path of cultivation for conferred knights is arduous. Instead of taking things one step at a time, you'll be wasting your time in order to pretend to have talent. You'll be taking your future as a joke. The two students nodded subconsciously, and their gazes toward Feng Xingjian were filled with disdain. Rhoda couldn't take it anymore and retorted, "What nonsense are you talking about?" Moreover, Feng Xingjian only participated in the regional selection a month ago and only completed his job transition this month. How would he have the time to cultivate the Thunderbolt sword technique in advance? Hearing Rhoda's words, Luo Nen was speechless for a time. He then said impatiently, "I don't care how he cheated. In any case, it's my turn. Just obediently learn the mountain shifting sword. I'm not as weak as Duoluan, and I definitely won't go easy on him." Luo Nen was ranked 34th and was a level 23 conferred knight. His mountain shifting sword had also reached level 15 perfection, and his sword art's prowess was above that of Duoluan's. However, no matter what they said, Feng Xingjian turned a deaf ear to them. How could a few meaningless trash talk and personal conflicts compare to the importance of learning sword arts? He would naturally speak with his sword arts later on. Moreover, the mountain shifting sword was even more powerful and complicated than the Thunderbolt sword technique in the previous stage. It was as the two students had said. The 4 stages and 4 sets of sword techniques in the Killing Techniques Palace were arranged according to the order of difficulty. The Thunderbolt sword technique in the previous stage summoned the ether particles in the air and turned them into lightning powers to attack. However, the mountain shifting sword used the sword force to guide the terrain, changing the geomagnetism and the power of the earth to guide the movement of the earth's tectonic plates, changing the terrain and creating earthquakes. How immense and violent was the energy contained in the earth. Once the various heat and kinetic energies were unleashed, they could destroy an entire city. How complicated would the sword theories behind the mountain shifting sword be in order to control and stimulate such powers? The moment Feng Xingjian laid his eyes on the mountain shifting sword, he was attracted by the exquisite theory behind it. He had carefully memorized each and every word. Thankfully, the conditions in the regional academy were outstanding enough, and there had been many experts in the past. The mountain shifting sword was filled with a large amount of annotations, all of which were the opinions of the experts in the past. Those who were able to leave their words here were naturally not ordinary people. Feng Xingjian even saw the opinions Hops had left behind. All of them dissected the difficult parts and explained them bit by bit, making it much easier for people to learn the mountain shifting sword. However, even though Feng Xingjian had read through every word to everyone present, the speed at which he was reading the book was still far too fast. He was not like ordinary conferred knights, who would need to spend half a day trying to decipher each sentence of the mountain shifting sword. Feng Xingjian had only read one sentence, paused for a moment, and then immediately read the next sentence once he had understood the profoundness within. Seeing the speed at which Feng Xingjian was reading the sword, Ronan could not help but let out a cold snort, putting on an act. After reading in detail for about 40 minutes or so, Feng Xingjian shook his head and did not continue reading. The two students who saw this scene became nervous. It was because this scene seemed to have just happened when they were learning the Thunderbolt sword technique. They looked at Feng Xingjian and thought in astonishment, could it be that he's learned it again? This time around, he's even faster than the previous time? Ronan's brows furrowed, and Rhoda asked directly, "Xingjian, you've learned it?" "Learned it?" Feng Xingjian shook his head. "How can that be possible? This sword technique is very complicated. How could he have learned it in such a short period of time?" I'm going to eat." Feng Xingjian looked at Ronan and said, "Do you guys still want to go out for your meals? Is there no one to send you in?" Of course, there was a food delivery service. However, seeing how Feng Xingjian still had the time to eat in the midst of learning the sword technique, everyone present felt helpless. Putting on an act, Ronan let out a cold laugh and shook his head. He did not believe that Feng Xingjian had managed to learn the Thunderbolt sword technique within an hour. He said to the two students next to him, "You could just bring them out to eat. I'm going to sleep." After that, He raised his head and fell to the ground. Not long after, bursts of snoring could be heard. However, Fang Xingjian did not care so much. If it had been the wild, there would have been nothing he could do about it. However, since he was in the regional academy, he naturally had to ensure that he ate once every 2 hours, ensuring that he had sufficient energy, essence, and nutrition intake. Only with sufficient energy would he be able to ensure that his body would be growing stronger through self-cultivation 24 hours a day, not wasting a single minute or second. The two students were helpless and could only bring him to the canteen in the Killing Techniques Palace. The entire Killing Techniques Palace received conferred knights to train here, and the conferred knights would need to train for several days or even months. Therefore, it was impossible for them to go out to eat every single time. The canteen was self-provided. After finishing his meal, Fang Xingjian returned to read up on the mountain shifting sword. Finally, 1.5 hours later, he drew out the demoness howl. Chapter 283. Seeing him draw his long sword, the two students looked over once again. Rhoda also stared at Fang Xingjian with great interest, as if she was waiting for something to happen. The first stage of the Thunderbolt sword technique is about controlling thunder and lightning. The second stage of the mountain shifting sword is about changing the geomagnetism. Electromagnetism and electromagnetism complement each other. Although the people in Miracle World haven't really established the natural sciences like those on Earth, with their outstanding martial techniques and abilities, as well as the support from things like heaven's perception and ether particles, the experts' understanding of a natural world might not lose out to those top-notch scientists on Earth. Thinking about the profoundness of the mountain shifting sword, Fang Xingjian's demoness howl started to dance around. It was as if he was stirring a ladle in a pot of porridge, and the entire space seemed to tremble. Everything in the world was formed from ether particles. It was the same for mountains and rivers, and it was the same for the human body. Mountains and rivers would have waves and form fields, and it was the same for the human body. The mountain shifting sword made use of the fact that both were formed from ether particles, allowing their fields to affect each other and eventually move mountains and seas. To ordinary people, the interference and changes between physical fields were like changes to one's aura. Therefore, the mountain shifting sword did not focus on the exquisiteness of the sword moves. The most important part was the aura, using the sword's aura to guide the mountain's aura. As Fang Xingjian slashed out with his sword, his aura changed completely. As he slashed out with his sword again and again, his aura also kept on rising. It was as if he had turned into a majestic mountain, standing majestically before everyone. Although his movements were slow, both his strength and aura were getting stronger and stronger. Even though they were several tens of meters away, everyone could feel that each time Fang Xingjian's longsword moved, it was as if he was stirring up the seas, stirring up the air, and creating loud banging sounds when he struck the ground. As Fang Xingjian's aura got stronger and stronger, the surrounding cliffs and mountains seemed to be faintly trembling. This was the mountain shifting sword slowly changing the movements of the mountains. Fatso Ronin, who had been sleeping soundly, suddenly opened his eyes. Streams of fierce light shot out from his eyes as he stared at Fang Xingjian, who was performing the mountain shifting sword in the distance. Did he really master it? But how is that possible? Could it be that someone broke the rules and leaked it to him? Who is so daring? A series of doubts ran through Luo Nan's mind. He could not believe that the other party would be able to master the mountain shifting sword in just 1.5 hours. Back then, how long had he taken to master this sword technique? Half a month or a month? He found it hard to believe that he could master it in an hour and a half. He shouted at Fang Xingjian, "You've mastered the mountain shifting sword?" Fang Xingjian glanced at him and said, "This swordsmanship is indeed complicated and abstruse. It took me quite a bit of effort to truly master it." Hearing this, Ronan felt displeased, especially when he saw Fang Xingjian's tall and young appearance. Flames of jealousy surged in his heart. He said in a clear voice, "Fang Xingjian, There's never been anyone in this world who has been able to master the mountain-shifting sword within such a short period of time. Compared to this possibility, I suspect that there's a conferred knight who has colluded with outsiders and imparted the mountain-shifting sword, committing treason. He spoke in a righteous manner, but his words were extremely sinister. If Fang Xingjian was really linked to the crime of treason and the crime of secretly spreading the mountain-shifting sword, then Fang Xingjian's future would be completely ruined. The empire was very strict in the investigation of things like secretly spreading the empire's martial arts. It could be said that even if a conferred knight were to do something like this, once they were found out, they would be sentenced to death. Therefore, hearing Ronan's words, Fang Xingjian's brows furrowed, and hints of malevolent aura were emitted from his body. He did not know if Ronan's words were sincere or intentional. However, no matter what, once news of this spread, even if it was proven that Fang Xingjian was not guilty, a layer of his skin would still be peeled off. Killing intent surged in his heart, and he did not plan on backing down. Of course, he could not back down at this moment. He had to retaliate fiercely and prove himself immediately. Otherwise, he might be dragged into a quagmire and be entangled by countless investigations and troublesome matters. This was especially so as Fang Xingjian's talent continued to be exposed. More and more people would know that he was able to pick up sword techniques very quickly. Therefore, Fang Xingjian had to settle this matter as soon as possible. He could not tolerate any slandering of his talent, especially things like privately imparting the mountain-shifting sword. Therefore, Fang Xingjian stared coldly at Ronan and said calmly, "This is how my sword arts talent is. There are things that divine-level experts and mediocre people like you can't do, but that doesn't mean that I can't do it." Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, Ronan's fury rose up in his heart, and he became bold. The fats on his face trembled, and he pointed a thick index finger at Fang Xingjian and said, "What an arrogant junior. I'll capture you today and hand you over to the association for a thorough investigation." Ronan had shed all pretenses of cordiality, and he did not give Fang Xingjian the chance to cultivate. He took action directly. As he spoke, his entire body trembled, and his disposition changed abruptly. He was clearly still plump, but the feeling he gave off now had nothing to do with being plump. Instead, he was filled with a vigorous, solemn, lofty, and majestic aura. The bones in his body trembled intensely, clashing against each other, and his vital energy and blood flowed crazily like a great river. As this aura soared up, the entire valley let out loud, creaking and cautious sounds. The sounds were extremely terrifying, giving off the feeling that the entire world and the sky had been torn apart by a giant. Rhoda and the other two students felt the huge tremors coming from under their feet, and their faces were filled with astonishment. This was the level 15 mountain shifting sword. Just the prelude to the activation of the sword had caused the Earth's veins to move, the mountains to collide, and the Earth's crust to tremble. It was as if the Earth was quaking and the mountains were swaying. Ronan was not holding onto a sword at all. He had only placed his fingers together like a sword, and as his sword fingers slid down, the mountain walls under his feet started to tremble intensely. Seeing the astonished expressions on Rhoda and the others' faces, Ronan appeared to be very pleased. However, when he saw Fang Xingjian's indifferent expression, he became infuriated again. On his plump face, a pair of eyes narrowed like two small dots. He glared fiercely at Fang Xingjian and said coldly, "The mountain-shifting sword focuses on the stance and not the moves. What's the difference between having a sword and not having a sword? Today, I'll let you have a taste of the true profoundness of the mountain-shifting sword." With a slash of his sword fingers, he slashed out toward Fang Xingjian across space. Simultaneously, the huge sword under his feet trembled intensely, and a shock wave was transmitted over. Chapter 284. The power of the Earth was extremely strong. This was obvious just by thinking about it. The compression between the tectonic plates of the continents formed mountain ranges and seas. How strong would the power be to be able to squeeze out Mount Everest and the Alps? How terrifying would the power be to be able to create tsunamis and destroy cities? These were the powers of the Earth's circulation. This extremely majestic power was transmitted through the tremors of the Earth. It did not seem to have terrifying special effects like explosions, lightning bolts, or fireballs, but those simple tremors carried a power that could destroy everything. It was just like what Ronan was doing now. As his sword force rose, the electromagnetic energy contained in the earth burst forth abruptly, transmitting toward Feng Xingjian's feet along with intense tremors. The prowess of such tremors was not to be underestimated. It was just like the tremors produced during an earthquake. They could be as small as tearing down buildings, or as large as tearing the ground and creating valleys. However, when faced with the attack of such tremors, Feng Xingjian did not block it at all. He allowed the tremors to hit his body. The violent power crushed through his body, but it did not cause him any damage at all. It was because when the tremors hit his body, they were blocked by the heavenly abyss annihilation armor on the surface of Feng Xingjian's body, then absorbed and neutralized them. If it were a spar like the one with Duoluan earlier, Feng Xingjian would only use his sword techniques to play around with his opponent and improve his skills. However, when faced with Ronan, he wanted to use his most violent and powerful side to crush his opponent. Sensing that the tremors were easily blocked by the heavenly abyss annihilation armor, Feng Xingjian threw a cold glance at Ronan and said, "That's it." Ronan let out a furious bellow and tapped out with his sword fingers. The earth trembled and the entire mountain seemed to be moving. Just as the tremors were heading toward Feng Xingjian's feet, countless stone spikes on the cliff were pushed out by majestic force, piercing toward Feng Xingjian. Rumble. Countless stone pillars and stone spikes gathered together, clashing and pressing fiercely. Then, under the bombardment of countless tremors, they were crushed and exploded. It was this seemingly simple attack, but its powerful force compressed the air, turning the entire sword platform into a vacuum field. However, after a series of attacks, Feng Xingjian was nowhere to be seen. With Boundaries Negation activated, Feng Xingjian took a light step forward and arrived behind Luo Nan. However, Ronan was a conferred knight after all. Even though Feng Xingjian had activated Boundaries Negation, he was no longer able to casually attack his opponent at 10 times that of supersonic speed like he had done in the past. All Luo Nan saw was an explosive shout. His sword fingers suddenly pointed upwards, and the earth beneath his feet split apart. Countless stone swords shot out. Under the impetus of a force that was comparable to a volcanic eruption, they brought along waves of air as they shot out like honeycomb missiles. However, when faced with the attacks, Feng Xingjian was like an evil god from hell. He allowed the stone swords, which were 5 to 6 times at a supersonic speed, to pierce his body, and then they were instantly shattered. He allowed the tremors under his feet to come smashing toward him, but they were easily neutralized by the armor. The level 29 Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor was far too powerful. Even if Feng Xingjian were to stand there without moving, Ronan would have to go all out in order to break through his defense. Moreover, how could Feng Xingjian possibly stand there without moving? Feng Xingjian walked toward Ronan step by step, slashing out casually with his hand. Relying on the sword force transformed from his sword bones and the toughness of the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor, he easily tore through the various stone spikes, stone pillars, and stone swords that were coming toward him. Ronan looked at this scene in disbelief and bellowed in his heart. How is this possible? With the eruption of my mountain-shifting sword, the tremors and stone pillars created by the Earth's compression are enough to turn an entire street into ruins. Even if they were made of steel, they would have been smashed into mud by me. How is it possible that he is able to block them just like that? Could it be that his body is formed from a divine weapon? Ronan retreated rapidly, only to see Feng Xingjian taking a few consecutive steps forward. Feng Xingjian's hand blade easily tore through his attacks, walking toward him step by step like an unrivaled battle god. Looking at this scene, The murderous gleam in Ronin's heart grew even more intense, and his aura rose once again. Concurrently, his level 15 mountain shifting sword was also unleashed at full power under the eruption of this power. The entire mountain valley trembled, as if an underground volcano had erupted. All the Earth's movements, tremors, and pushing forces gathered toward Feng Xingjian under Ronin's guidance. Kacha-kacha sounds seemed to ring out in the air, as if the entire space had been frozen. Wherever the tremors passed by, the earth would be compressed into powder, causing dust to fly up into the air. What was even more terrifying was that the surrounding mountain valley was like a big mouth that was closing up. Under the push of the electromagnetic energy that erupted from deep underground, all the rocks on the walls of the mountain pressed toward Feng Xingjian, and the mountain valley started to close up. They were like mini giants, bringing along an extremely violent force as they charged toward Feng Xingjian. The full power of the level 15 mountain shifting sword was unleashed. The power of this attack was enough to overturn mountains and rivers and change the terrain. It could truly be said that the world had changed. Rhoda and the other two students looked at this scene in horror. Due to the immense pressure, they had nowhere to run under the impact of the mountain range. They could only watch as the mountain valley closed up and the mountain range came crashing toward them. Senior Marshall brother, stop it. Ronin, are you crazy? It was a pity that Ronin had already reached this stage, so how could he possibly hold back? Right now, he was unleashing his full power, and it was not something that he could stop just because he wanted to. However, just then, the demoness howl in Feng Xingjian's hand was raised up high. Everyone felt their bodies become light, and as the world spun, their vision turned black. It was as if the entire sky was going to collapse. The Terra ingurgitation absorbed the gravity within a radius of 1 kilometer. Without the help of gravity, all the mountain ranges and rocks seemed to be flying toward the sky. The Terra ingurgitation was the nemesis of the mountain shifting sword. Without the restraints of gravity, the balance of all the forces in the earth was broken, and Ronin's mountain shifting sword instantly lost control. At the same time, the longsword in Feng Xingjian's hand pressed down. Before Feng Xingjian could even get close, the huge sword platform under Ronin's feet had already shattered into pieces. Everything before Ronin's eyes turned dark, and his ears buzzed. His sense of sight, hearing, and even touch had been completely taken away by the violent sword attack. Feeling an intense threat to his life, Ronin let out a long howl, and the fats all over his body started to shrink and weaken at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye. He had activated a secret killing technique that he had been cultivating. It allowed him to store a large amount of power in his body, forming the form of fats and storing them. At the critical moment, he could burn them all and unleash them, increasing his battle prowess by several times. However, it was still not enough. Faced with Feng Xingjian's terra ingurgitation, Ronin felt that no matter how much he unleashed his power, it would not be too much. As he burned off all his fats, his feet sank into the stone platform, and it was as if he had become one with the earth. I'll go all out. At the next moment, he tapped out toward the demoness howl with his sword fingers. Chapter 285. Other than power, the earth had another attribute, which was to bear the weight of everything in the world. The earth gave birth to and bore the weight of everything in the world. Be it volcanoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, or all sorts of natural disasters, the earth would be able to endure them silently. Even a nuclear explosion or a full-powered attack from a divine-level expert will be nothing more than a drop in the ocean to the earth. Expansive, deep, and vast. These were another attribute of the earth, and they were also the greatest profoundness of the mountain shifting sword. It was said that one could endure and remain unmoving like the earth. Under the reinforcement of layers of increasingly violent powers, the mountain shifting sword at the end possessed the strongest defensive ability. After Ronin unleashed his full power, a mysterious connection was formed between his entire body and the entire valley. Auras interacted with each other, and ether particles interacted with ether particles. The mountain shifting sword was cultivated to the limits of level 15, allowing Ronin's body to connect with the entire valley. He might not be able to be as vast and deep as the actual earth, but he could transfer most of the attacks that his body had to endure onto the entire valley, allowing the valley to withstand the power of Fang Xingjian's terra ingurgitation. Since you're using the entire valley's power to smash me, I'll use the entire valley to defend against you. At this moment, the duo's sword arts, spirit, and auras clashed against each other, forming a marvelous cycle. Finally, Ronin's finger came into contact with the tip of Fang Xingjian's sword. The entire world seemed to have quieted down at this moment. The clouds in the sky stopped moving. The mountains and rivers that were faintly floating in the air fell silent, and even the wind stopped its clamor. Rhoda and the other two students' mouths were agape as they tried their best to stabilize their bodies. At the next moment, violent air currents shot out from the tip of Ronin's finger and sword. Several 100,000 kilograms of smoke and dust were blasted up into the air, engulfing the two of them. An uncountable amount of power was unleashed onto Ronin's body and then transferred to the top of the valley. The ground, which had been about to float earlier, seemed to have been slapped down fiercely by an invisible palm, and a large area of cracks and explosions started. The mountains exploded, and the cliffs shattered, turning into countless huge rocks and sand that gushed down. This was a landslide. The ground was torn apart, the valley was compressed, and the entire valley started to collapse. This was a crack in the earth. The collision between the two caused the mountains to crumble and the earth to crack. The entire canyon was on the verge of collapsing. Luonin couldn't see or hear anything. His entire body was trembling crazily all the time. Every bone and every muscle was groaning to the limit. At this moment, Luonan felt as if the entire world was far away from him. When he came back to his senses, he felt that his entire body was sore and painful, as if his bones and muscles had been torn apart. His body was pressed down by a 1,000-pound boulder. Once again, he exerted his strength violently to push away the large pieces of rubble on his body. After he crawled out, he spat out a large mouthful of blood. Right now, Ronin did not look like a conferred knight at all. His clothes had been torn into pieces, and his head and face were covered in gray dust. He looked like a miner who had just come out from a mine, especially after he had unleashed his vital energy and blood and burned his fats. He was no longer fatso. Instead, he was emaciated with his cheeks sunken in. He looked like a bamboo pole, as if he would collapse at the slightest gust of wind. This exchange with Fang Xingjian had turned him from a conferred knight into a refugee. The moment he crawled out, his limbs felt sore and weak. His ether particles were in a state of chaos, and his heaven's perception was like a television that had lost its signal. It was filled with static and gibberish. This was because he had depleted a large amount of his physical strength, and his mental energy could no longer keep up. He started to feel giddy, and he could no longer maintain his heaven's perception. However, when he lifted his head, he saw Fang Xingjian standing before him without a speck of dust on him. It was as if nothing had happened. The demoness howl in Fang Xingjian's hand had shattered into pieces, but he did not seem to mind it at all. Instead, with a wave of his palm, he activated the mountain shifting sword. The earth continued to compress, as if it was compressing a pimple. A stone spike was squeezed out and delivered to his hand. He took the long sword form from the stone spike calmly and activated his specialty, Swordless Path. A level 19 inferior divine weapon once again appeared in Fang Xingjian's hand. He stroked the blade of the sword, looked at Ronin calmly, and asked, "You managed to survive my terra ingurgitation. It's true that your mountain shifting sword has reached an extremely high realm, and it's very powerful in terms of strength and resistance to attacks. However, I still have boundaries negation, which allows me to fight at 10 times the speed of sound. Since we're done competing in strength, do you want to try speed?" Ronin opened his mouth, as if wanting to be more forceful and take on Fang Xingjian's words. However, when he looked at the extremely calm and spotless Fang Xingjian, and then at the entire valley, he realized that there was no longer any valley. Or rather, it was not that there was no valley anymore. It was that after Ronan and Feng Xingjian's exchange, the entire valley had collapsed, turning into a huge crater filled with crushed rocks and soil. Seeing how Ronan was unable to say anything despite opening his mouth, Feng Xingjian shook his head and loosened his grip. The stone spikes shattered into countless small pebbles, scattering in the wind. You've lost your courage and determination. Even if you were to use the mountain shifting sword, you won't be able to display 30% of its profundity. There's no point in me making another move. However, you'd better remember the lesson today. You can eat whatever you want, but you can't say whatever you want. If I find out that you've slandered me again, I'll kill you with a single sword attack. With that, Feng Xingjian turned to leave, leaving Ronan with a cool back view. Which conferred knight would be able to take it after being taught a lesson by someone else? Reality was not a novel. There was no such thing as getting to know one another through a fight. After being defeated, one would end up admiring the other party and humbly seek guidance. After being defeated, one would put in great effort in their cultivation, holding their breath and wanting to win back. This was the norm. Feng Xingjian, don't fall into my hands. Ronan glared at Feng Xingjian for a while before he turned to leave, limping out of the hall. Feng Xingjian walked up to Rhoda and asked, "Are you all right?" Right now, Rhoda and the other two students were also covered in dirt. Although they were not the two's targets, just the repercussions from the attacks were enough to make them suffer. If it was not because they had reacted in time and the other two students, who were confer knights after all, had taken care of Rhoda, she would have been seriously injured. Seeing Feng Xingjian walk over, the two students unconsciously took a few steps back, as if some ferocious beast had barged in. Rhoda shook her head and looked at Feng Xingjian with a strange gaze. "Is this the move you learned from the Pantheon Monument? It's called Terra Ingurgitation. It's really amazing." This was already the third time she had seen Feng Xingjian perform the Terra Ingurgitation. However, no matter how many times she saw it, the feeling that this move gave her was that it was extremely powerful. This circulation of force, this brutality, this move must be the pinnacle of strength. However, Feng Xingjian shook his head and said, "It's just the surface. Let's go and take a look at the next stage." Chapter 286. Therefore, Feng Xingjian let the two students lead the way. After all, the entire canyon had been destroyed, and the original cliff and stone path had disappeared. Thus, he and Rhoda naturally did not know where the next stage was. Feng Xingjian had originally planned to take a break, or even head to the Killing Techniques Palace after 2 or 3 days. However, Ronan had suspected that Feng Xingjian had practiced the killing techniques of the Killing Techniques Palace in advance. Although Feng Xingjian had used his sword to shut Ronan up, he wanted to clear the Killing Techniques Palace within a short period of time. Only then could he truly prove his talent and be able to pick up a top-notch killing technique within 1 or 2 hours. The four of them continued on, passing through many pavilions and gardens. Not long after, they suddenly heard rumbling sounds. "This is the sound of water?" Rhoda's brows twitched as she asked, "There's a river in the Killing Techniques Palace?" The two students nodded hesitantly. However, they seemed to have thought of something, and there was a hint of fear in their eyes. After walking for another few hundred meters, the rumbling sounds grew louder and louder until they were almost deafening. It was as if there was a great river and a waterfall not far away. After the four of them turned a corner, endless water vapor came gushing toward them. It was as if it was drizzling, and a huge lake appeared before them. This was a jade-green lake. Not only was the lake huge, but it was also like waves. Waves of 1 meter tall splashed onto the shore, as if the entire lake was moving and breathing. The rumbling sounds that everyone had heard earlier came from the center of the lake. A water pillar that looked like a heavenly pillar, yet also like a waterfall, descended from the sky, smashing onto the surface of the lake. The water pillar was very large, and it looked like a waterfall. It kept smashing onto the surface of the water, creating rumbling sounds. It was also because of this that the water kept smashing down, resulting in the rumbling sounds and the water vapor dancing in the air. Rhoda looked at the sky in astonishment and said, "Why is there a waterfall falling from the sky?" A student said, "This is the aquatic sword formation set up by the second-generation headmaster. It can condense water vapor from the sky and form a heavenly waterfall, adding water to the lake endlessly." There was a hole at the bottom of the center of the lake. The water in the lake was constantly flowing through the hole to the underground river, and then it was constantly replenished by the water vapor in the sky. This caused the entire lake to be filled with huge waves, undercurrents, and whirlpools. Even if a conferred knight were to enter the water, he would have to be careful at all times, lest he be swept into the underground lake. This is the third stage of the Killing Techniques Palace, the Heavenly Waterfall Lake for cultivating the aquatic sword formation. Looking at the majestic and miraculous Heavenly Waterfall Lake before her, Rhoda felt relaxed and happy. The scene before her was truly magnificent. Even if an ordinary person were to look at it, the depression in their heart would be dispelled. If one stayed here for a long time, they would most likely be broad-minded and do things in a magnanimous manner. Of course, the prerequisite was that one had to be able to withstand the omnipresent humidity and the deafening sound. Fang Xingjian asked, "Then where can I learn this aquatic sword formation?" One of the students looked at the turbulent lake waters with lingering fear. He pointed to a huge stone tablet in the distance and said, "It's on that stone tablet." Rhoda and the others walked over and saw that the stone tablet was densely packed with words, as well as various diagrams and annotations. It was the aquatic sword formation that they had to learn for this stage. Just as Fang Xingjian was reading through the aquatic sword formation, the surface of the entire lake suddenly surged. A figure suddenly burst out from the lake's surface and landed heavily on the beach. It was a lady who was drenched from head to toe. Her hair was tied up high, and she was only wearing a swimsuit. The lady had long black hair, and the contours of her muscles and bones were very obvious. Coupled with her wheat-colored skin, one could tell that she was very powerful. However, the moment she landed on the shore, she abruptly spat out a mouthful of water and then looked in the direction of the lake with a pale face. Not long after she landed on the shore, the entire lake seemed to have started boiling. A huge whirlpool suddenly formed and spread out, revealing a pitch-black hole. It was as if it was connected to hell. Another lady who looked even more mature-looking slowly rose up from the whirlpool. Her entire body was supported by layers of waves. Although she was wearing a night attire, she did not seem to be wet at all. The moment she appeared, a baleful look flashed on her face. She stared at the lady on the shore and said, "What are you afraid of?" The most important part of cultivating the aquatic sword formation is to enter the Heavenly Waterfall Lake and train the sword formation through the lake's undercurrents and watercurrents. This heavenly waterfall was created by the second-generation headmaster back then, and the watercurrents in it all contain the profoundness of the aquatic sword formation. Cultivators must advance courageously, overcoming all obstacles and slashing out a path of survival in the sword formation. Only then will they be able to cultivate the aquatic sword formation successfully. The moment you enter the water, you're very careful, guarding against all sorts of things. You don't even have the slightest bit of determination to forge ahead. How are you going to cultivate the aquatic sword formation? Back then, when I was cultivating the aquatic sword formation, I tied a metal chain around myself and dashed toward the center of the lake. At most, I'd just drown and be dragged out. If you don't even have this bit of courage, why are you still cultivating? When Rhoda and the others heard this, their hearts skipped a beat. This was really a ruthless lady. To think that back then, she had tied a metal chain around herself and dashed toward the hole in the center of the lake. It was clear that she did not care about her life when she started cultivating. Her actions and disposition, as well as the baleful look on her face, all showed that she was a ruthless character. After teaching the lady on the shore a lesson, the lady turned and looked down at Fang Xingjian and the others. When she saw the two students, she frowned and said, Weren't the two of you cultivating the Thunderbolt sword technique with Dwelluin in the first stage? Why are you here? The 4 stages of the Killing Techniques Palace are not meant to be as you wish. You're old people, so why are you barging in here today? Under the lady's gaze, the 2 students were like cats who had seen a mouse. They shivered and straightened their bodies, saying, Miss Ada, we're here to send Fong Xingjian over. He won the first 2 stages, but doesn't know the way to the 3rd stage. Therefore, we're sending him here. Fong Xingjian? The mature lady called Ada's gaze turned and landed on Fong Xingjian. She asked, You're this year's regional champion, Fong Xingjian? Ada was a level 24 conferred knight, ranked 25th among the students, and she was a female swordsman. Seeing that Fong Xingjian had nodded, Ada asked puzzledly, You should have just entered the academy last month, right? You've already defeated Dwelluin and Ronan today? Her tone was filled with great doubt and disbelief. The 2 students said, It's true. Moreover, Fong Xingjian only came to the Killing Techniques Palace today and has already learned the Thunderbolt sword and Mountain Shifting sword. Ada's eyes were still filled with doubt. She looked at Fong Xingjian and asked again, I heard that the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor is with you now. Is that true? If the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor was really with him, then it would explain why he had been able to reach this stage. Chapter 287. Fong Xingjian was not interested in denying it and said directly, That's right. I'm wearing the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. Why? Do you want me to take it off and challenge you later? Ada rolled her eyes and asked curiously, Oh, you're willing to leave such an important armor, a level 29 superior armor aside, to fight against me? Of course not. Fong Xingjian said resolutely, I'm not a fool. If I were to leave my treasure aside to fight against someone and lose my armor, others would only say that I'm a fool. No one would compensate me with a new set. You're quite observant. However, a gleam seemed to flash in Ada's eyes. In that instant, she seemed to have thought of many things. In the end, she could not help but say, Fong Xingjian, this armor of yours is too useful to me. Are you willing to lend it to me? Ada was currently at level 24, and her ether synchronization rate had reached 59%. She was about to reach 60% and strive for level 25. Every 10% ether synchronization rate was a barrier, and each breakthrough was a calamity. This was why it was called the 10 Heavenly Barriers. It required a conferred knight's extremely strong will and spirit. The Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor contained the remnant consciousness of the level 29 expert, Damarov. If she could use this remnant consciousness to train her will and martial spirit, it would increase the success rate of Ada's breakthrough. However, how could a great treasure like the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor be lent out so easily? If the other party did not return it after borrowing it, Fong Xingjian would not be able to do anything about it. Therefore, he shook his head firmly and said, How can a great treasure like this be lent out so easily? Moreover, we're not acquaintances. It's impossible for me to lend out the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. Don't be in a hurry to reject me. Ada persuaded. I'm only using the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor to train my martial will in preparation for breaking through 60% ether synchronization rate. It's not that I won't return it to you. Moreover, don't you want to hear what I'm going to use to borrow the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor from you? Fong Xingjian was indeed very curious about this. Therefore, he pretended to listen attentively. Ada said, Right now, your greatest danger is from the First Prince, right? Based on what I know, the First Prince has already staked everything on this in order to attain great perfection in the 36 Hells maps and recreate a scene that hasn't been seen for several hundred years. It was true that Fong Xingjian's talent was rare among the generations of royalty, and he had also obtained a set of divine remains from the Holy Sea of Truth. It was as if he was constantly absorbing information from divine-level experts. It could be said that within a year, he would be able to attain the divine level at any moment. Once he attains the divine level, the second prince will no longer be able to protect you. And in order to cultivate the 36 Hells maps, the first prince will definitely bring you under his banner. You might not have a good understanding of the cultivation of the Hells map, but I can tell you that once you sign the Hells map, you won't be able to decide whether you live or die. Your every thought and action will be grasped by the first prince, and you'll completely become his puppet. You'll truly be living a life worse than death. Therefore, the reason why you're in such a hurry to cultivate and display your talents so crazily is because you hope to be able to go up against the first prince, right? Ada was very accurate with regards to this. In her opinion, Feng Xingjian's greatest worry was the first prince. It was only under the first prince's overwhelming pressure that he would cultivate crazily, even to the point of clearing 2 stages in the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. Feng Xingjian did not comment on this, and merely said, "Even the second prince is unable to go up against the first prince. Could it be that you have a way?" A mysterious smile appeared on Ada's face as she said, "There are 5 princes under his majesty. The first prince and the second prince aren't the only 2 princes. It's true that the first prince's talent is outstanding, but at the end of the day, it's just because he's the eldest son of the first wife and has obtained the most resources. The second prince has great influence, and the reformist party is well established. However, it's only because he was born earlier than the others. You guys don't know that among the 5 princes, the 5th prince is the most powerful one. His talent is unparalleled. His talent in fist arts is something that no one else has in the past or in the future. Given time, he'll definitely become the world's top expert." Feng Xingjian did not care about talent. After all, no matter how talented the 5th prince was, it was impossible for the 5th prince to be more talented than him. He merely asked, "You're saying that if I hand over the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor to you, you'll be able to convince the 5th prince to protect me?" Of course not. If you want to convince the 5th prince, you'll have to take the initiative to hand over the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. As if sensing Feng Xingjian's disapproval, Ada smiled coldly and said, "Feng Xingjian, I know that geniuses like you are arrogant and conceited. You think that with your small talent, you'll be able to move forward and strive for the divine level, dominating the world. However, if you meet the 5th prince, you'll understand that before him, your small talent is like the difference between a torch and the sun. You'll probably never be able to imagine how talented he is. It's just like how cicadas in summer will never be able to imagine how ice and snow look like." Ada's tone was a little fanatical as she said confidently, "I can introduce you to the 5th prince. After you meet him, you'll naturally lend me the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor." Feng Xingjian did not have much interest in such fanatical fans, nor did he pay any heed to the 5th prince whom she held in such high regard. He turned his head to look at the aquatic sword formation. Since he had already cleared 2 stages consecutively, he planned to be even more serious. He might as well clear all the sword techniques in the Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Therefore, he continued to read through the aquatic sword formation and was once again engrossed in it. Ada smiled coldly. She thought to herself, "You don't know what's good for you." Then she continued to guide the students under her. Rhoda felt a little puzzled and asked, "5th prince? Why do I remember that the 5th prince has never liked fighting and killing since he was young? He has always been learning how to draw and write. Out of the 5 princes, he's the only one who doesn't cultivate martial arts, right?" A student next to her nodded and said, "That was the case in the past. However, I heard that the 5th prince encountered an assassin a few years ago. Therefore, he learned from that painful experience and started to cultivate martial arts. I wonder if that's true or not." Feng Xingjian had already completely immersed himself in reading through the aquatic sword formation. This was another extremely interesting sword technique. It condensed the water vapor in the world through the exchange of energy with ether particles, forming the aquatic sword cheese. Then, by setting up the aquatic sword cheese in a large area of space to form the aquatic sword formation, one would be able to condense water vapor over a large area and then control the sword formation through the aquatic sword cheese, producing unrivaled destructive and defensive prowess. The most amazing thing about this aquatic sword cheese was that as long as one could set up a sufficient amount of aquatic sword cheese, the amount of water vapor that one could condense and control was almost limitless. Of course, while the sword formation was limitless, humans had their limits. Despite this, it was said that the second-generation headmaster of the Great Western region had once performed the aquatic sword formation in the northern ice region, condensing water vapor and turning the area within a range of 100 leagues into a lake. Chapter 288. Seeing how Feng Xingjian seemed to be very logical and very serious, Ada thought to herself as she trained the students. Like female knights like Rhoda, Ada had also grown up in an aristocratic family. She had received the best education and top-notch cultivation resources. In addition to her outstanding talent and willingness to work hard in her cultivation, she had been able to become a level 24 conferred knight. Despite this, she was already 38 years old this year. She had gotten married when she was 28 years old. It was a pity that her husband had attempted to attain the heavenly barrier of 30% ether particles when she was 30 years old. He failed and became a vegetable. This was the worst situation. Because becoming a vegetable was not a true death, both families did not allow Ada to get a divorce and get married in order to maintain their reputations and honor, making her a living widow. Ada continued to blame herself and put all her energy into cultivation. However, her mood continued to worsen, and her temper also became increasingly irritable. She would flare up at the slightest provocation and became an old woman that no one in the entire academy was willing to pay any attention to. Harsh, strict, and bad-tempered, this became everyone's impression of her. This continued until 2 years ago, when she had been hunting ferocious beasts in the wild and had met the fifth prince. This time around, she had been completely convinced by the fifth prince's demeanor, talent, and abilities. In her eyes, there was no other man in the world who could be compared to the fifth prince. Thinking of the fifth prince, Ada unknowingly broke into a smile, and her gaze toward Feng Xingjian became even colder. It just so happens that the fifth prince's fist theories are connected to sword theories. After reading through the aquatic sword formation and observing the heavenly waterfall lake, he imparted me the heavenly waterfall / Even if you're wearing the level 29 heavenly abyss annihilation armor, you won't be able to fend off this move created by the fifth prince. I'll use this move to defeat you so that you'll know that there's always someone better out there. Feng Xingjian continued to eat and cultivate. About 1.5 hours later, he opened up his 5 fingers as if he could feel a gush of water vapor gushing toward him. In the blink of an eye, countless water droplets continued to gather above his palm, forming a long sword made of water. Rhoda smiled and asked, "You've mastered the aquatic sword formation?" Feng Xingjian shook his head and said, "This is only the aquatic sword cheese. You'll need to set up at least 12 aquatic sword cheese in order to condense a sword formation." Therefore, under the astonished gazes of the 2 students, Rhoda, Ada, and the others, Feng Xingjian condensed stream after stream of aquatic sword cheese in his hands. After each stream appeared, he would toss it into midair. In the blink of an eye, 12 streams of aquatic sword cheese had appeared. The moment the 12 streams of sword cheese appeared, a mysterious connection was born between them. Feng Xingjian seemed to have become the control center of a transit station, continuously exchanging information and energy with the 12 streams of sword cheese through ether particles. The corners of Feng Xingjian's lips curled up into a hint of a confident smile. He tapped out lightly with his sword fingers, and 12 streams of sword cheese circled around his body, dancing about like floating forts. He laughed out loud, casually took out a stream of aquatic sword chi, and danced with it. The water sword in his hand swung about freely, and the remaining 11 streams of sword cheese around him moved about, slicing through the air and releasing poochie-poochie sounds. Feng Xingjian tapped his long sword across space, and the 11 streams of sword cheese shot out consecutively. As the streams of sword cheese moved about, They lifted up several 10,000 jin of sand on the shore. Even Rhoda and the others could sense that the aquatic sword chis were circulating at high speed, containing an unparalleled slashing force. Regardless of what rocks or sand they encountered, they would all slash through. They were extremely sharp, just like high-speed water blades. Wherever the aquatic sword chis passed by, there would be a sense of dryness gushing forth. This was the result of the aquatic sword chis ceaselessly absorbing water vapor to replenish the depletion from slashing. Once the aquatic sword chis were formed, the 12 streams of sword chis, including the one in Fang Xingjian's hand, would continue to absorb the water vapor in the world. Moreover, they would replenish each other at any time. The aquatic sword chis that were formed circled around Fang Xingjian like they were his arms, hitting wherever he pointed. The air whistled, and as the sword chis moved about, more and more water vapor continued to gather in Fang Xingjian's direction. Stream after stream of aquatic sword chis were continuously condensed by him, and a large amount of water vapor gathering made it seem as if a heavy rain had fallen on the heavenly waterfall lake. A large amount of water vapor gathered together, forming water droplets that eventually gushed into Fang Xingjian's palm, condensing stream after stream of aquatic sword chis. The aquatic sword formation could be considered to be at level 1 by condensing 12 streams of aquatic sword chis. From then on, it would continue to grow, and at level 5, it would be able to condense 121 streams of aquatic sword chis. At level 10, it would be able to condense 277 streams of aquatic sword chis. Right now, Fang Xingjian had already condensed 49 streams of aquatic sword chis, reaching level 4 of the aquatic sword chis. He was now able to further control the water vapor. The sword chis in his hand swept out, and the remaining 48 streams of aquatic sword chis swept out in all directions. They were like exploding fireworks, vaguely taking up an area with a radius of 100 meters around him. Fang Xingjian nodded and said, "You've finally achieved something." He turned to look at Ada and said, "Please give me some guidance on the aquatic sword formation." Ada stood in the middle of the heavenly waterfall lake. The heavenly waterfall in the sky came crashing down, but it was as if it had been slashed apart by invisible sharp blades above her head. The water was unable to touch her body at all. Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, she laughed coldly and said, "You want me to give you guidance with just a level 4 aquatic sword technique? We'll talk after you enter the heavenly waterfall lake." Fang Xingjian smiled faintly and was already taking one step at a time, heading in the direction of the heavenly waterfall lake. The 48 streams of aquatic sword chis around him were like floating cannons, turning into many mysterious trajectories and circling around his body. They also looked like countless satellites. The way this sword formation operated could be said to have both offense and defense. It could be used to attack or defend in any direction at any time. Fang Xingjian walked into the heavenly waterfall lake and slowly submerged his entire body into the water. The aquatic sword chis also merged into the water. The aquatic sword chis were condensed from water vapor to begin with, and now that they entered the water, they were like fish in water, becoming more than 10 times more agile. However, at the same time, Fang Xingjian could also sense that the omnipresent undercurrents and waves in the lake were like streams of water-shaped shock waves smashing out toward his body. The power of water was very strong. The undercurrents in the sea could knock people unconscious, drag them deep into the sea, or even shock them to death. The power of tsunamis could drown cities, killing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people. The heavenly waterfall lake had been created by the second-generation governor back then. The various undercurrents and waves in the lake were all circulating according to the aquatic sword formation's ingenuity. The omnipresent shock waves were like endless sword waves, smashing out toward Fang Xingjian. Seeing how Fang Xingjian was swaying from the blows, the corners of Ada's lips curled up, revealing a hint of a disdainful smile. At the same time that Fang Xingjian was being hit, he sensed the circulation of the aquatic sword formation in the lake. He had been relying on his level 29 Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor to intentionally get hit so that his body could experience the profoundness of the sword formation. Chapter 289. Even though Feng Xingjian had relaxed his body, there were still shock waves formed from streams of water that continued to hit his body. Sensing the waves of sword forces hitting his body, Feng Xingjian continued to experience the profoundness of the aquatic sword formation. At the next moment, his entire body trembled, and he put his fingers together like swords. The streams of aquatic sword chis that had already merged into the lake water started to roar together. They were like streams of water dragons, swimming around and clashing against the shock waves that were attacking Feng Xingjian. They continued to deplete each other's power. Feng Xingjian was controlling his aquatic sword formation to go up against the Heavenly Waterfall Lake's aquatic sword formation. However, the entire Heavenly Waterfall Lake was like a huge millstone. The vortex at the bottom of the lake in the middle, together with the waterfalls descending from the sky, seemed as if they were going to crush everything in the lake water into dust. This was equivalent to using the powers of the world to attack the opponent. Meanwhile, Feng Xingjian was controlling his aquatic sword formation, relying on his own power to go up against the powers of the world. Streams of water waves continued to be destroyed, and the aquatic sword chis that he had condensed were also being depleted. In the blink of an eye, more and more shock waves struck his body, exploding into large amounts of water. The aquatic sword formation that Feng Xingjian was controlling started to shake. However, at the same time, as it continued to go up against the powers of the entire Heavenly Waterfall Lake, Feng Xingjian continued to sense and comprehend the profoundness of the entire sword formation. The speed at which he was controlling the aquatic sword formation was also increasing. In the scene that his consciousness had constructed, the shock waves formed from the lake water were very obvious. The trajectories that they passed by shone brightly in his mind, and the countless trajectories continued to stack up, change, and surge, forming the shape of the entire formation. Just like that, Feng Xingjian suddenly started to slowly move towards the center of the lake. The entire Heavenly Waterfall Lake was formed from the Heavenly Waterfall and the underground vortex. The closer he got to the center, the stronger the power of the formation. This was especially so in the center, where the speed of the water currents was over several meters per second. Moreover, these rapid currents were clashing, spinning, and slicing each other. Even if steel were to fall in, it would be instantly torn into pieces. And the closer Feng Xingjian got to the center of the lake, the greater the pressure he felt. In the center of the lake, there was not a single drop of water within 5 meters around Ada. It was as if there was an air bubble surrounding her. All the water currents seemed to have become docile kittens when they reached her. Behind her, the female knight, who was only wearing a swimsuit, exclaimed, "How amazing! To think that he has started to comprehend the profoundness of the sword formation in such a short period. This guy's talent is really terrifying. He might really be able to enter the center of the Heavenly Waterfall Lake." Ada shook her head and said, "Humph. The Heavenly Waterfall Lake isn't something that can be broken through so easily. The closer one is to the center of the lake, the greater the pressure one will face." Ada, heavens! The wave Feng Xingjian's Ada will. The waves of the pressure. XT of the sword of the sword. However, just as Ada said this, the sword force in Feng Xingjian's hand changed once again. Streams of shock waves clashed against his aquatic sword chis. Not only were they unable to weaken the aquatic sword chis, but they were instead gradually neutralized by the aquatic sword chis. The speed at which the aquatic sword chis were formed instantly doubled. They were actually able to withstand the surrounding shock waves and charge toward the center of the lake at an accelerated speed. What? Ada looked at this scene in astonishment. Back then, she had charged into the lake time and time again, going all out in her cultivation before she finally got used to the attacks in the lake. However, she had also spent half a year's time. And yet, Feng Xingjian had only spent over 10 minutes there. How long had it been? Yet he was already able to get used to the attacks from the sword formation. What kind of joke was this? It was a pity that Feng Xingjian was not joking around. Right now, countless light spots were flashing in his mind, and countless trajectories were circulating. All of them were the sword formation's changes and weaknesses. As he watched the sword formation circulate, he continued to control the aquatic sword chis to move up and down, left and right, then absorb and redirect the incoming attacks. Compared to attacking, the aquatic sword formation was actually a sword technique that excelled in defense. Surrounded by countless aquatic sword chis, it was enough to gradually buffer and absorb any attacks. Feng Xingjian continued to absorb the attacks from the entire heavenly waterfall, charging toward the center of the lake. Seeing that Feng Xingjian was getting closer and closer, Ada's expression also turned solemn. It was an unprecedentedly solemn look. She had originally been a female knight with dreams, a future, and hope. However, after so many years, she had come to understand reality. Especially after meeting a genius amongst geniuses like the Fifth Prince, she had a deeper understanding that the talent of some people in this world was just so unreasonable. Even if ordinary people were to spend 10 or even 100 times more time, they might not even be able to comprehend as much as them. However, although she was astonished by Feng Xingjian's talent, she was even more confident in the Fifth Prince. His Highness is going to become the strongest man in the world. How can you possibly imagine how powerful and terrifying he is? Although it's true that Feng Xingjian is amazing, he's someone who only appears once every 100 years. In the future, he'll at most become Governor Devitt, or someone like one of the Empire's 10 great divine-level experts. And the Fifth Prince will become someone who will stand above the Mage Kings, the Pope, and the Founding Emperor. He'll be in existence who can change history. Just as she was thinking of this, Ada's eyes were filled with confidence. She put her palms together, and streams of white cheese continued to condense in her hands. In the blink of an eye, they formed a stream of aquatic sword cheese. At the next moment, over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese appeared in the entire heavenly waterfall lake. The water of the entire heavenly waterfall lake seemed to have frozen in that instant. How long had Ada been cultivating in the heavenly waterfall lake? Every day, she would gather sword cheese into the lake, and her understanding of the heavenly waterfall lake was unparalleled. The aquatic sword formation she performed almost encompassed the entire heavenly waterfall lake. With this activation, Ada's control over the heavenly waterfall lake reached a new limit. Meanwhile, Feng Xingjian felt as if the surrounding lake water had suddenly turned into cement, making each of his movements and sword moves 100 times more difficult than before. However, this was merely a warm-up for Ada. She did not plan on holding back against Feng Xingjian. She had just set up the aquatic sword formation when she once again activated her sword cheese, activating the powerful killing technique that the Fifth Prince had specially created for this location in her, the heavenly waterfall slash. A loud rumble rang out. Under everyone's astonished gazes, the heavenly waterfall lake that was descending from the sky suddenly came to a standstill. At the next moment, the entire heavenly waterfall lake seemed to have condensed into a stream of aquatic sword chi, piercing out fiercely toward Feng Xingjian with an extremely powerful impact. Chapter 290. The heavenly waterfall that came crashing down from the sky seemed to have gathered all the rainwater in an entire city and poured down together. How terrifying was the impact? The impact of the water could cause a huge explosion in the ground and then form a tsunami that was several meters tall. The water current would surge out at a speed of several thousand meters, tearing everything in its path into pieces. It was a lot more terrifying than ordinary air explosions because its mass and density were far above that of air. Sensing the heavenly waterfall long sword piercing toward him, Feng Xingjian's expression was extremely grim. Facing such an attack, even if he could use the power of terra ingurgitation to slash through it immediately, the heavenly waterfall seemed to be endless. Every time he slashed through a section, he would be engulfed by waves and waves of water. Moreover, he could only perform terra ingurgitation once an hour. Therefore, without any hesitation, Fang Xingjian used heaven's perception at the first instant and sent his consciousness into the heavenly abyss annihilation armor. Right now, he needed power. He needed the great power contained in this level 29 armor. Almost at the same instant, he activated the heavenly abyss annihilation armor. Waves of overwhelming aura soared into the sky. The entire heavenly waterfall seemed to have a feeling of rising temperature. Of course, this was just an illusion. However, the remnant consciousness of a level 29 expert, just a subconscious willpower impact, still gave off a feeling as if the world was changing. Simultaneously, the entire heavenly abyss annihilation armor appeared on the surface of Fang Xingjian's body. Many dragon, scale-like armor enveloped his body, moving along with the changes in his physical strength. The surface of the scales reflected streams of light that were like hints of flames. Streams of faint white light emerged from Fang Xingjian's arms, legs, and other parts of his body, forming many geometric figures. Many mysterious formation diagrams appeared behind Fang Xingjian's body. Acceleration force field, physical force field, automatic calibration force field, high-temperature resistance force field. Many force fields appeared as the heavenly abyss annihilation armor was awakened. These force fields once again increased Fang Xingjian's destructive prowess. In void space, an endless amount of power gushed into Fang Xingjian's body. He felt as if his body had been inflated and was growing up. His power kept on increasing crazily, as if there were explosives exploding in his body. Roar! Like a boiling kettle, Fang Xingjian sensed the explosive power in his body. He opened his mouth and let out a long roar. Under the transformation of his sword bones, the air currents from his roar turned into a stream of sword chi that was over 100 meters long. It slashed down from the sky and slashed the incoming waterfall into two, splitting it in front of him. If it could be said that Ada's control of the heavenly waterfall to attack Fang Xingjian was like the heavenly river overturning and stirring up the Milky Way, then Fang Xingjian's shout was like the heavenly river overturning and splitting the Milky Way into two. This was the level 29 heavenly abyss annihilation armor. This was a level 29 superior divine weapon set. It had finally displayed its most blatant violence to the world for the first time after its appearance. I'm not done yet. However, how could Ada possibly give up? She clenched her sword arts tightly with both hands, and the heavenly waterfall that had split into two was like two slithering snakes, once again dashing out toward Fang Xingjian from the left and right with an unparalleled impact. The atmosphere was trembling, the ground was trembling, and the entire heavenly waterfall lake seemed as if it was boiling. The water gushed forth like a magnificent army, wanting to tear everything before them into dust. However, Fang Xingjian, who had activated the heavenly abyss annihilation armor, was not afraid at all. He punched out, and a stream of heavenly waterfall flowed in reverse. Amidst a series of explosions, sections of air and water mixed together and exploded, sent flying back into the sky by the sword force. Fang Xingjian stomped on the ground, and a faint white force field flashed under his feet. Then he charged out like a rocket. The world seemed to be stretched out at this moment, and the air was torn apart, forming a vacuum passageway. Before it could be filled up again by the surrounding air, Fang Xingjian had already punched out once again. An astonishing sword chi that was several hundred meters long shot out with a swoosh. Amidst a tearing sound that shook the area within a range of several thousand meters, the heavenly waterfall that was descending from the sky was pushed back. Fang Xingjian punched out after taking a few steps forward. The scales all over his body trembled crazily, and power gushed forth endlessly from void space, replenishing Fang Xingjian's depletion, strengthening his bones, muscles, vital energy, and blood. With each punch, there would be a white glow formed from the ether particle's force field, increasing the speed and strengthening layer by layer, amplifying Fang Xingjian's power. Streams and streams of astonishing sword cheese continued to tear through the sky, pushing back the heavenly waterfall. They caused the heavenly waterfall to be unable to descend, and they continued to gather in the sky. At this moment, Fang Xingjian finally arrived at the center of the lake. Ada looked at Fang Xingjian and smiled coldly, thinking to herself, "So what if you've managed to block off the heavenly waterfall for now?" The lake water continued to gather in the air. The more you try to suppress them, the greater the power they will gather. The longer it takes, the stronger the accumulated power will be. I don't believe that you'll be able to continue fending them off. This guy must be thinking of attacking me, right? I'd like to see how you're going to break through a sword formation formed from over 1,000 aquatic sword cheese. As Fang Xingjian pondered, over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese spread out in the lake were all activated. Countless water threads shot out, encompassing Ada's entire body and turning her into a huge water ball with a diameter of over 50 meters. No matter what kind of attack it was, it would be able to absorb and neutralize it in an instant. It was easy to see how resistant water was to attacks. Even if a force of several thousand tons were to hit the surface of the sea, it would only cause a huge splash. With the water ball with a diameter of 50 meters, how strong would the attack have to be in order to reach Ada? However, just as Ada was thinking of this, Fang Xingjian suddenly made a turn and dashed toward the surface of the lake. What is he trying to do? Just as Ada was thinking of this, Fang Xingjian clasped his fists together and raised them high above his head. His body swelled up abruptly, and violent power shot out in all directions, causing the air to tremble and explode, releasing a series of explosive sounds. At the next moment, Fang Xingjian plunged down like a meteor, his fists hammering down fiercely. A series of rumbling explosions rang out, and at the instant when Fang Xingjian's fist came into contact with the surface of the lake, a terrifying power burst forth, gushing out toward the heavenly waterfall lake like a tsunami. Rhoda and the others only felt a huge tremor under their feet, and they felt as if they were unable to stand still. With this punch from Fang Xingjian, the entire heavenly waterfall lake was sent flying into the sky. The power of a single punch had blasted an entire lake's water into the sky. How violent and barbaric was this power? After activating the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor, Fang Xingjian had brought out the word violence to the extreme. At the sight of this scene, Ada gasped, almost unable to believe her eyes. At the same time, she felt that the over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese she had painstakingly condensed were all shattered into dust. She had lost control over the entire heavenly waterfall lake. However, at the same time, the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor on Fang Xingjian's body also started to fade. He had reached the limits of how much he could use the armor. If he were to continue using it, Damarov's consciousness in the armor might injure him. Ada let out a long breath. The pressure that Fang Xingjian, who was wearing the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor, had given her was far too great. Now that the armor had disappeared, she seemed to have relaxed. However, she was not able to relax for long. Fang Xingjian's fingers were like swords, and with a slight movement, Ada once again opened her eyes wide as if she had seen a ghost. Chapter 291. As Fang Xingjian moved his sword fingers, the gradually descending heavenly waterfall changed its direction. Impossible. How is this possible? The heavenly waterfall was set up by the second-generation headmaster. Even the aquatic sword formation is unable to control it. If the fifth prince had not created the heavenly waterfall based on the flow of the heavenly waterfall lake and the principles of the aquatic sword formation, even I would not be able to control the heavenly waterfall. How on earth did Fang Xingjian do it? Many thoughts flashed through Ada's mind at lightning speed. However, they were unable to stop the heavenly waterfall that was descending from the sky. It was as if a white waterfall had cut across the sky and pressed down toward Ada. Before it even got close, strong gales were already gushing toward Ada, almost making it hard for her to breathe. The water vapor in the sky had also arrived in advance, as if a rainstorm had descended from the sky. Behind Ada, the female student who was wearing a swimsuit was screaming with a pale face. With her abilities, it was impossible for her to fend off the impact of the heavenly waterfall. She would probably be smashed into pieces. Ada let out a furious bellow, and streams of aquatic sword cheese condensed on her body. She continued to absorb the lake water to envelop her body. She used one of her sword fingers to control the aquatic sword formation, while her other hand pointed toward the ground. Her aura suddenly changed, as if she had turned into a majestic mountain standing there. As the guardian of the third stage, she had naturally mastered the mountain shifting sword of the second stage. As she activated the mountain shifting sword, she had already connected herself with the surrounding terrain in order to fend off the heavenly waterfall that was descending from the sky. At the next moment, it was as if the Milky Way was sweeping down, and the heavenly waterfall crashed fiercely onto Ada's sword formation. However, it was as if an egg had been torn apart. The ball of water that could fend off the main cannons of a battleship was instantly crushed. Then the heavenly waterfall continued to attack Ada's body mercilessly. Ada felt as if a mountain had smashed down on her body. The bones in her body let out a series of creaking sounds, and she spewed out a large mouthful of blood. At the next moment, she was completely engulfed by the water, falling into the lake. At the same time, the ground trembled violently, as if it was a magnitude 5 earthquake. Ada had used the mountain shifting sword to shift the attack she had received onto the ground. The sky waterfall returned to normal once again. Feng Xingjian slowly returned to the shore. Rhoda and the others were all shocked to the core. Just then, a series of explosive sounds rang out from the lake, and Ada dashed out with the female cadet in hand. With just a few steps, she landed on the shore. The female student at the side was still in a state of shock, and her entire body was drenched in the lake water. Ada, who was at the side, was also panting heavily. Her face was pale, and there were many broken bones all over her body. Her internal organs were bleeding, and her spine was also severely injured. In fact, if she had not used the profoundness of the mountain shifting sword to divert most of the attack, her body would have been torn to pieces. Even so, her injuries were still very serious, but she still insisted on raising her head. She looked at Feng Xingjian and murmured, "How did you control the sky waterfall?" "This is the heavenly waterfall created by the second-generation headmaster. Even the aquatic sword formation is unable to control it." "How did you control it?" Feng Xingjian said calmly. "Didn't you control it? I learned from you." "Learned from me?" Ada's expression became agitated. "That's the sky waterfall slash, not the aquatic sword formation. You haven't even learned the sky waterfall slash before. So how did you learn from me? Didn't you use it in front of me? I saw you use it once, and you learned it." "Learned it after seeing me use it once?" Ada looked at Feng Xingjian in a daze, her eyes filled with doubt. "How is that possible?" Feng Xingjian said casually, "There's nothing impossible about it. It's just an application of the aquatic sword chi. Using the principle of water vapor rising and cold air sinking, it allows the sky waterfall to temporarily break through its limits. I'll be able to understand it with just one look." These words caused Ada's countenance to change drastically. She had not expected that Feng Xingjian would be able to so casually explain the principle behind the sky waterfall slash. Back then, even though she had heard the fifth prince explain this principle, she had only started to gradually understand it after comprehending it for a few days. Feng Xingjian had actually learned it after seeing her use it once. In that instant, a great sense of defeat surged up in Ada's chest. She suddenly thought of how the fifth prince had also sat quietly before the heavenly waterfall lake for an entire day and night before he was able to create this sky waterfall slash. Yet, Feng Xingjian had managed to learn it with just one look. Although the fifth prince cultivated fist techniques, and creating it was much harder than learning it just by seeing it, this still dealt a blow to Ada's confidence in the fifth prince. The Feng Xingjian before her seemed to overlap with the fifth prince. At that moment, Ada's confidence in the fifth prince was no longer as strong as before. I must inform the fifth prince. I'll send a message immediately. This Feng Xingjian's talent is really extraordinary. However, Feng Xingjian asked, "Can we head to the fourth stage now?" Ada lifted her head, took a long look at Feng Xingjian, and said, "There's no need for you to be anxious. There's no guardian for the fourth stage of the Killing Techniques Palace. After all, the purpose of defeating the guardian in the first 3 stages is to learn the sword technique for the next stage. The fourth stage is the final stage. Once you learn the sword technique, you'll be able to come out directly. There's no need for you to defeat the guardian." Hearing Ada's words, everyone present regained their senses and turned to look at Feng Xingjian. This meant that at this moment, Feng Xingjian had already cleared all 4 stages of the Killing Techniques Palace. The student who had followed Feng Xingjian from the first stage mumbled, "Clearing all stages of the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. Has something like this ever happened in the Academy's history? No, no one has ever done something like this. This Feng Xingjian has created history. We've all become witnesses to history." Ada took a few deep breaths and then brought the other female students with her to treat their injuries. Feng Xingjian and the others headed to the next stage to learn the final sword technique in the Killing Techniques Palace. Simultaneously, another group of people walked over from the entrance of the Killing Techniques Palace. It was Holt, who was dressed in aristocratic attire and appeared suave and elegant, like an elegant young master. As a student under the tutelage of a divine-level expert, he was also the one who had come in second in the regional selection after losing to Feng Xingjian. Next to Holt was a man with big eyes and a skinny figure. When his eyes opened and closed, spiritual chi would seep out from them. The man looked at Holt and smiled, saying, "Holt, you'll definitely be able to create a new record in the Killing Techniques Palace this time around. You've attained Heaven's Perception in less than a month and even completed the second transition. There aren't many people in history who have done this. Even that Feng Xingjian from your batch. I heard that he's still training day and night in the sacred land, right? I heard that he even wasted his time creating his own nurturing sword technique. For us to create our own nurturing sword techniques is too much of an overstatement. Today, you'll start challenging the Killing Techniques Palace. With your talent, you'll be able to clear all 4 stages in half a month at most. By then, you'll definitely be able to suppress that Feng Xingjian. That you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.